The night Audrey Whitcomb's life fell apart, a stranger walked into it and made everything infinitely worse. She was sitting alone at the hotel bar, two glasses deep into something she couldn't afford, when the silver-haired woman slid onto the stool beside her and said 4 words that should have sent Audrey straight for the door. "I need your help." Audrey almost laughed. She had nothing left to give anyone. She'd just been fired. She was 63 days behind on rent. Lepsine the Psaltskeeting, her 16-year-old sister, was waiting at home, trusting Audrey to figure it out the way she always figured it out. Because that was the deal, that was the only deal Audrey had ever made that actually mattered. She should have said no, she didn't. And if you've ever made a decision in the worst moment of your life that somehow turned out to be the most important one, then you already know exactly where this is going. Stay with me, because this story is just getting started. If you're watching this for the first time, hit that subscribe button right now and turn on notifications so you never miss what comes next. Drop your city or your country in the comments. I want to see how far this story has traveled. Like this video if you think Audrey made the right call. And if you think she was out of her mind, comment that too. Now let's go. The bartender set down a fresh glass of water Audrey hadn't ordered, which told her exactly how bad she looked. She pushed it aside anyway. Water wasn't going to fix a termination letter, a landlord's final notice, and the specific dread of being the only adult standing between a 16-year-old girl and a world that didn't care whether either of them made it. Audrey had been an event coordinator for 4 years. She was good at it, genuinely good. The kind of good that makes you invisible, because everything runs so smoothly that nobody notices the person holding it together. That invisibility had finally cost her. The company restructured. The department disappeared. Her name was on a list that included 8 other people who also thought they were safe, right up until the moment they weren't. She'd spent the afternoon submitting applications from a coffee shop because she couldn't face going home yet. Penny would look at her with those steady brown eyes that saw too much, and Audrey would have to find words for a situation she hadn't processed herself. So she'd come here instead. To this hotel bar she walked past every day on the way to the office she no longer had. She'd ordered something expensive, because sometimes you spend money you don't have just to pretend for 30 minutes that the disaster isn't quite as total as it is. That was when Constance Blackridge sat down beside her. Somewhere in her early 60s, dressed in the specific way that money does when it's been present for generations rather than recently acquired, nothing flashy, everything precise. Silver hair pulled back, pearls that weren't trying to prove anything. The kind of posture that came from being told since childhood that the room would notice you whether you wanted it to or not. She ordered sparkling, looked at Audrey the way experienced people look at someone who is very carefully not falling apart, and said, "You look like someone who just got the worst news of her life." "Close enough," Audrey said. "Then you're the right person." Audrey turned to look at her properly. The right person for what? Constance didn't answer immediately. She studied Audrey with the thoroughness of someone who'd spent decades assessing situations quickly and accurately. It wasn't rude, it was just extremely direct, which was somehow worse. "There's a dinner this evening," Constance said finally. "At my home, I need someone to attend as my son's fiancée." Audrey stared at her. "I'll pay you $20,000. The number sat in the air between them, like something that had fallen from a height. Audrey heard it. She understood every individual word. She could not make the sentence make sense. 20,000, she repeated. "For one evening, the dinner runs, perhaps 3 hours. You would pose as my son's fiancée to a family we have a complicated relationship with. You would behave as though the engagement is real, convincing, and has been developing for some time. At the end of the evening, you go home. The money transfers to your account within 48 hours. Audrey looked at her water glass. She looked at the bartender. She looked back at Constance. "What's the catch?" "My son doesn't know about this arrangement." "He doesn't," Audrey stopped. "You want me to show up at your house and tell your son we're engaged? Your son, who has no idea who I am. I want you to appear at dinner and play a role convincingly enough that our guests believe it. My son will understand the necessity once the evening is over. And if he doesn't, he will." There was something absolute in the way she said it. Not threatening, just certain. The way people are certain about gravity. Audrey found it unsettling in a way she couldn't immediately name. "Who are these guests?" Audrey asked. "The complicated family?" Constance looked at her, sparkling water. "The Lockwoods." The name meant nothing to Audrey. She said so. "That's probably for the best," Constance said. "I need more than that, if you want me to walk into your house and lie to strangers." Audrey surprised herself a little with how steady she sounded. Inside, she was calculating rent and groceries and Penny's school trip deposit that was due in 12 days, and the precise number of weeks she could survive without income before the math became unsurvivable. Constance seemed to respect the directness. She folded her hands on the bar. "My son runs our family's business interests. He is 37, he is very capable, and he is also currently being pressured into a marriage arrangement with the Lockwood family's daughter. This marriage would benefit the Lockwoods considerably. It would not benefit my son. He has refused, repeatedly, but Warren Lockwood is persistent, and this dinner is another attempt to advance the arrangement. So you want a fake fiancé to block a marriage proposal, to demonstrate that the question of my son's future has already been settled." Audrey sat with that for a moment. It was on its face, a comprehensible scheme. The kind of thing that happened in movies where everyone wore better clothes and nobody had to think about next month's utilities. "What kind of business?" she asked. Constance met her eyes. "The kind that has made the Blackridge name significant in Boston for 40 years. Something shifted in Audrey's chest. The careful phrasing, the lack of specifics, the fact that this woman had spotted a stranger at a bar and seen immediately that she was desperate enough to say yes to something she didn't fully understand yet. "When you say significant," Audrey said slowly, "I mean powerful," Constance said. "And private." Audrey understood then. She wasn't stupid. She understood completely what kind of family she was being invited into for one evening, for $20,000, in a midnight blue gown she hadn't picked out herself. She should have stood up, paid her bill, walked out into the Boston night and found another way. Instead, she thought about Penny, sitting at their kitchen table, working on an algebra problem she'd explain to Audrey later, but because Penny always explained things, as though Audrey were a person who deserved to understand the world properly. She thought about the lease agreement. She thought about 12 days, and a school trip deposit, and 63 days already gone. "I'll do it," she said. Constance nodded, as though she'd never seriously considered another outcome. The gown was midnight blue and cost more than Audrey's rent. Constance had arranged its size, cut, everything with the efficiency of someone who had made rapid assessments of strangers before. It fit almost perfectly, which was either impressive or unsettling or both. A car arrived at 7:15. Audrey sat in the back and watched Boston slide past the window and tried to remember how she normally looked when she was confident. She was an event coordinator. She'd managed corporate dinners for 200 people, charity galas with last-minute disasters, wedding receptions where the groom's family and the bride's family were actively at war. She knew how to be composed in rooms where the pressure was high. This was different. She knew it was different the moment the car turned onto the street and she saw the mansion. It wasn't ostentatious. That was the thing that struck her. It was old Back Bay architecture, the kind of building that had been standing since before anyone currently alive was born, brick and iron and window lights that made the whole structure look like it was being held together by history. The kind of house that doesn't announce itself because it doesn't need to. Audrey got out of the car. Her legs worked. She was grateful. Constance met her at the door with the unhurried calm of a woman who had navigated difficult situations so many times that she'd stopped registering them as difficult. She looked Audrey over once, made the smallest adjustment to the strap at her shoulder and said, "You'll be fine." "You should tell me his name again," Audrey said. "Just so I'm saying it correctly when I—" Ronan. Ronan. She practiced the weight of it. Ronan Blackridge. The man she was allegedly in love with. The man she had never met. "He's in his study," Constance said. "I'll bring you to him now." The Lockwoods arrive at 8. Audrey checked her watch. 40 minutes. They walked through the house high ceilings, dark wood, a kind of ordered quiet that felt less like absence, and more like the house itself was watching and stopped outside a closed door. Constance knocked twice and opened it without waiting for an answer. The man behind the desk looked up. He was not what Audrey had pictured. She had assembled an image during the car ride, older, maybe, soft in the way that people who give orders get soft and odd. The kind of man who intimidated through accumulated power rather than presence. She'd been completely wrong. Ronan Blackridge was 37 and built like someone who hadn't forgotten what it cost to be here. Dark hair, jaw that needed a shave, shoulders that filled out his jacket without any effort in either direction. He had the kind of face that wasn't handsome in any easy or comfortable way, but that you would absolutely remember, because there was something concentrated in it. Like a person who had learned a long time ago to use very few words and make every one of them count. He looked at Audrey. Then he looked at his mother. The silence that followed was not peaceful. "Mother," he said. His voice was low and very controlled. "Who is this?" "This is Audrey," Constance said. "She'll be joining us this evening." As your fiancée." Every line of Ronan Blackridge's body went completely still. He was still looking at his mother. He had not looked back at Audrey. That somehow made it worse, the sense that he was managing a very significant internal event before he allowed his face to do anything at all. "Come in," he said finally to Audrey. "Close the door." She came in. She closed the door. She was aware with absolute clarity that Constance remained on the other side of it. Ronan stood. He was tall, she registered that as he came around the desk. He stopped about 4 feet from her and looked at her, the way she imagined. People looked at classified documents they weren't sure they were supposed to have read. "How much is she paying you?" he said. Not a question, exactly. 20,000, Audrey said. Something moved across his face. Not surprise. More like the particular exhaustion of a person who has correctly predicted a situation they had very much hoped they were wrong about. "And you agreed." "I need the money. Most people who need money don't walk into a Blackridge dinner with it." "I didn't know what kind of dinner it was until after I'd already agreed." She held his gaze. "If I'd known earlier, I probably would have asked for more." A pause. Something shifted almost imperceptibly in his expression. "The Lockwoods," he said. "You know anything about them?" "Your mother said the name. That's all. Warren Lockwood is not a patient man, and he is not a stupid one. His daughter Geneva has been in every room I've been in for the last 6 months because Warren decided I should marry her, and when Warren decides something, his family mobilizes accordingly." He paused. "The engagement was my mother's idea to stop that. I figured. I would not have chosen this approach." "What would you have chosen?" He looked at her like she'd asked something slightly unexpected. "Something I controlled." "Then control this," Audrey said. "I'm a good liar when I have to be. I can hold a conversation. I can read a room. I can stay composed when things get uncomfortable." She was pitching herself, she realized. Pitching herself to a man she'd met 4 minutes ago in a room that probably cost more to furnish than she'd made in the last 2 years. "You don't have to like this. You just have to let it work." Ronan studied her for a moment. Before he could respond, the sound of tires on the gravel drive outside reached them through the window. He looked towards the sound. His jaw tightened. "They're early," he said, and something in the word early carried the specific weight of people who arrive ahead of schedule because they want to see what you look like when you're not ready. He turned back to Audrey. "What's your last name?" "Whitcomb." "Audrey Whitcomb." He repeated it once, silently. Then he straightened his jacket, extended his arm, and said with the complete flatness of a man doing something he had not chosen, "If we're going to lie, make them believe every second of it." Warren Lockwood walked in like he owned the house. That was the first thing Audrey noticed. Not aggressive, not rude, just the particular ease of a man who has been power long enough that he enters spaces the same regardless of whose they are. He was in his late 60s, heavier than Ronan, but solid with it, silver-haired and clear-eyed, and wearing a smile that said he was pleased to be here, while his eyes said something considerably more complicated. Behind him came Geneva. Audrey had half expected something obvious, a woman deployed, strategically beautiful in a calculated way. Geneva Lockwood was beautiful, but there was nothing strategic looking about it. She was 30 or so, dark-haired, composed. A sound like green wood splitting, and she looked at Ronan the moment she entered the room with an expression that Audrey recognized immediately because she'd seen it before in people who'd been told they were owed something they hadn't received yet. Geneva looked at Audrey 2 seconds later. The temperature in Audrey's chest dropped several degrees. Constance moved through the introduction with extraordinary smoothness. This is Audrey, Ronan's fiancée. They met 8 months ago. It happened quickly, the way these things sometimes do. Warren's smile stayed exactly where it was. His eyes did not. 8 months, he said pleasantly, and we're only hearing about it now. Ronan is private, Constance said. You know that, Warren. I do. Warren looked at Audrey. Where are you from, Audrey? Connecticut originally, she said. I've been in Boston 4 years. What do you do? Event coordination. Corporate and charitable work, mostly. That's interesting. It clearly wasn't to Warren. Where did you two meet? She had 3 seconds. She and Ronan had not discussed this. She'd had 40 minutes in a car ride, and she had not thought to establish a meeting story because she'd been too busy, trying to remember how to walk normally in heels on someone else's marble floors. A charity dinner, Ronan said without hesitating. She was managing the event. I spent 40 minutes trying to get her to talk to me between her other responsibilities. That's not quite how I remember it, Audrey said, and she didn't plan it. It came out on its own, the instinct of someone who knows that a story only sounds true when the people telling it slightly disagree. Ronan looked at her. He was in the way, she said, with the specific tone of a woman explaining a mildly ridiculous recurring memory. Politely, but persistently in the way. I had a floral arrangement crisis happening in one corner and a sound system problem in the other, and Ronan Blackridge was standing in the middle of the room like he had nowhere else to be. A beat. I had nowhere else I wanted to be, Ronan said. The delivery was quiet and entirely without performance, which made it land harder than anything embellished could have. Audrey felt something shift somewhere behind her sternum that she firmly categorized as nothing and immediately moved past. Geneva was watching this exchange with the focused attention of someone collecting data. It must be very new, Geneva said. Her voice was smooth and calibrated. An engagement. We hadn't heard. We aren't in the habit of announcing things to people who aren't family, Audrey said. A half-second pause. Geneva smiled. Warren set down his glass. I'd love to hear more about your work, Audrey. The events you've managed. The people you've worked with. And there it was. Not hostile, not yet. Just the very deliberate interest of a man beginning to catalog what he didn't know about the stranger who had appeared in a room where she had no business being, wearing a gown she hadn't chosen, holding the hand of a man she'd met an hour ago. Audrey smiled back at him with the professional warmth she'd spent 4 years developing. What would you like to know? Dinner lasted 2 hours. Afterward, Audrey would remember it the way you remember, a thing you survived not in sequence, but in flashes that had real weight. Warren, leaning forward over the fish course, asking her what she knew about Ronan's business interests. Audrey saying she knew what mattered to her, which was who he was when the business wasn't in the room, and watching Warren's eyes sharpen at the non-answer, even as he smiled at it. Geneva asking with beautiful casualness how Audrey felt about the kind of life Ronan's position required. The unpredictability, the demands, the absence. Audrey saying she'd spent years managing events where the ground changed under her feet every 30 minutes, and she'd learned that predictability was overrated. Geneva looking at her with something that was almost respect and almost something harder. Ronan's hand against the small of her back during the transition from the dining room to the sitting room. It was a light touch, brief, and it was for Warren's benefit. She knew that. But it was also steady in a way that surprised, like someone who had done the thing and committed to it rather than gesturing toward it. She leaned into it slightly, instinctively, and felt him register the adjustment. Warren, near the end of the evening, telling Ronan jovially that he'd expected to find him still considering his options. Ronan saying that he'd stopped considering his options 8 months ago, and he said it while looking at Audrey, and the specificity of the look made something inside her go very quiet. When the Lockwoods finally left Warren's goodbye warm and wide, Geneva's measured, both of them processing the front door closed, and the house went silent. Constance disappeared discreetly. It was just Ronan and Audrey in the entryway, and the quiet between them was a different kind of quiet than the house's usual sort. "That was well done," he said. "I told you I could handle it. You told me you were a good liar." He looked at her with that same concentrated attention. That's not exactly what happened tonight. She wasn't sure what he meant by that. She wasn't sure she wanted to examine it closely. "Warren doesn't believe us," she said. "No, he's going to dig." "Yes. So one dinner wasn't enough." Ronan was quiet for a moment. He looked at the door Warren had just walked through. He looked at Audrey with the expression of a man calculating something he hadn't planned to calculate tonight. "No," he said, "it wasn't." He turned to face her fully. 3 months, he said. "I need the engagement to hold for 3 months, until the Lockwoods decide the pressure isn't producing results. You'd live in the guest house on the property. Public appearances when necessary. Availability when Warren's people are watching." He paused. $60,000. The number hit her the same way the first one had. 60, she repeated. "It's a significant ask. The money reflects that." She thought about what $60,000 meant. Not the abstract version of the number, the real version. Penny school, the lease, something resembling a margin. The first time in 5 years that she wouldn't be calculating to the week. She thought about the way Warren Lockwood had watched her at dinner with the methodical patience of someone who was already 3 steps ahead and perfectly comfortable waiting. She thought about Ronan's hand at the small of her back. "Rules," she said. He waited. "Business only, no emotional complications. No pretending in private. Clean separation at the end of 3 months, regardless of where we are." Ronan looked at her for a long moment. "Agreed," he said. He said it the way he said most things. Quietly, and like he meant it. Audrey took a breath. She was absolutely certain she was about to make the second most significant decision of her adult life in a stranger's entryway in a gown that cost more than her monthly paycheck. Significant decision she'd made, the first most significant the one she'd made. The night Penny's school called and said their mother wasn't picking up anymore, that one had turned out mostly right. Eventually. "Okay," she said. 3 months. Ronan nodded. Outside somewhere in the Boston night, Warren Lockwood was in the back of his car, already making calls. And the fake engagement that was supposed to last one evening had just become something neither of them had a map for. The guest house was smaller than the main mansion by any measure, but it was still the nicest place Audrey had slept at in years. That was the thing that bothered her most. On the first morning, waking up in a room with actual crown molding and a window that faced a garden somebody tended carefully, and feeling guilty about how good the mattress was. She lay there for 11 minutes before she got up. She knew it was 11 because she checked her phone twice, once to confirm the time and once because Penny had texted at 6:48 asking if everything was okay, and Audrey hadn't answered yet. She typed "Everything's fine. New work opportunity. I'll explain tonight." She stared at that for a moment, then deleted the last sentence and sent the first 2. Explaining tonight was optimistic. Explaining at all required finding language for a situation she couldn't describe accurately without making Penny panic, and keeping Penny from panicking had been Audrey's primary professional skill for 5 years. It was the job before the job. It was the job that didn't end. She showered, put on her own clothes, the ones she'd packed in the bag. Constance's driver had collected from her apartment the previous night and found the guest house kitchen stocked with things she actually ate. Coffee, real coffee, not the ground-up desperation she'd been buying at the discount grocery 2 blocks from her apartment. Eggs, bread that hadn't been reduced for quick sale. She stood in the kitchen and drank her coffee and thought about Warren Lockwood's eyes over the dinner table and how they'd moved across her like a scanner, methodical and unhurried, collecting everything they touched. 3 months. She just needed to get through 3 months. A knock at the guest house door came at 8:15. It wasn't Ronan. It was a man she hadn't met, early 40s, compact, with the kind of stillness in his posture that didn't come from relaxation. He introduced himself as Von Merrick, Ronan's head of security. "Mr. Blackridge would like 15 minutes of your time," Vaughn said. "When you're ready." "I'm ready now." Vaughn looked at her coffee cup. "Finish your coffee," he said. It wasn't unkind. It was just information delivered with the efficiency of someone who understood that people needed small dignities even when everything else was in motion. She finished her coffee. Ronan's study looked different in daylight. The previous night it had been the territory of a confrontation, dim, charged, full of the specific tension of two people trying to figure out what the other person was. In the morning, it was just a room. Books, a drafting table pushed against the far wall with something face down on it, a desk that held a laptop and 3 folders, and a coffee cup that had been there longer than his. Was standing at the window when she came in, which she'd already started to understand was a thing he did, positioned himself in relation to the exit or the view, rarely behind the desk when he had a choice. "How did you sleep?" he said. "Fine," a pause. "The bed is better than mine." He turned from the window. "I need to go over some things with you before Warren starts his investigation in earnest. He'll have someone pulling background within 48 hours, if he hasn't started already." "What kind of background?" "Employment history, financials. Who you know and who knows you." He came to the desk and opened one of the folders without looking at her. "Your employment record is clean. The termination was a restructure, not performance. That won't give him anything." She felt the mild unreality of having a stranger recite the recent history of her professional collapse back to her. "You already looked. Last night. After you went to the guest house. He didn't apologize for it. Your financials are tight. He'll see that. Tight is a polite word for it. Warren will interpret financial pressure as a motive for fraud. That you're here for the money and nothing else." He looked up. "Which is partially true." "Mostly true," Audrey said. Ronan studied her for a moment. The distinction matters, because when he finds the financial picture, he'll bring it to the table in front of other people. He'll frame it as evidence that you're not what you're presenting as. You need to be ready for that. Ready how? Know what to say. Not defensively. Warren likes defense, it confirms his theory. You need a different posture. What posture? The one you had last night when he asked about my business. The non-answer that wasn't obviously an evasion. She thought about that. I was buying time. It looked like confidence. There's a difference in effect, even when the internal state is the same. He closed the folder. The story we need is consistent. 8 months, the charity dinner, gradual. I'll have Vaughn compile a timeline for you to review events we plausibly would have attended, things you'd know about me that fit a natural progression. What things? He was quiet for a second. The ones that sound personal without being useful to anyone. She heard what he wasn't saying. He would give her the performance material. The curated version. The things that could be known safely. "Okay," she said. "One more thing." He looked at her directly. Your sister went still. "Penny," he said. "She's 16. She lives with you. She's in her junior year. Warren will find her." Warren doesn't need to know anything about Penny. He already does. Anyone who pulls your background gets your dependent filing status inside of an hour. His voice stayed even. "I'm not raising this to alarm you. I'm raising it because we need to consider whether Penny needs to know anything about this arrangement before Warren finds a way to use her ignorance against us." The room felt like it had shifted slightly on its axis. "You think he'd go after a 16-year-old? I think Warren Lockwood goes after what's available." His jaw was set and there was something in his face that wasn't quite. It was more like a person who has been cold about necessary things for so long that the temperature has become the default. He won't hurt her. That's not his method. But he could reach out to her directly. Ask questions. A teenager who doesn't know she's supposed to maintain a story will tell the truth. Audrey's coffee was sitting in the guest house, and she suddenly wanted it very badly. She wanted something to hold. She stood with her hands at her sides and thought about Penny opening the door to a stranger, or answering a call from a number she didn't recognize, and cheerfully telling whoever it was that she'd never heard of Ronan Blackridge till 2 weeks ago. "What are you suggesting?" she said. "That we tell Penny a simplified version of the truth. Enough so that she isn't blindsided. Not enough to frighten her. She doesn't frighten easily. Good. Then she can handle knowing that you're working with our family on a professional basis and that there may be people who ask her questions that are designed to create problems. She doesn't need the details. She needs to know to call you immediately if anyone contacts her." Audrey looked at the drafting table, at the paper that was face down on it. She wondered what was on that paper and then told herself it didn't matter. Fine, she said. I'll talk to her tonight. The first public appearance happened 4 days in. A fundraising reception at a gallery in the South End, the kind of event where the art on the walls was secondary to the social architecture happening in front of it. Ronan moved through the room the way Audrey had expected, contained, acknowledged by everyone, engaged with almost no one unless he chose it. She stayed beside him and did what she'd done at 100 events in a professional capacity, except this time she was part of the exhibit. 3 different people asked how they'd met. She told the charity dinner version each time, and each time Ronan added something small that she hadn't anticipated, a detail that sounded true because it had the specific weight of something remembered rather than constructed. The 40 minutes at the event, the floral arrangement crisis, the way she'd looked at him when he was in the way, like she was genuinely considering whether to ask him to move. She didn't know when he'd developed the habit of adding these details. She hadn't asked him to. He just did it, calmly and precisely, and it was more effective than anything she'd have scripted. A woman named Deborah 50s, South End old money, the type who collected information at parties, the way other people collected business cards, cornered Audrey at the drink table and said, with beautiful friendliness, Ronan's always been so impossible to read. I can't imagine what it's like to actually know him. It takes a while, Audrey said. He doesn't advertise much. How did you get past it? Audrey considered. I stopped waiting for him to open a door and walked through the wall and said. She picked up her wine. He respected that more than patience would have gotten me. Deborah looked delighted. That's exactly the kind of thing someone who actually knows him would say. It wasn't until later, in the car going back, that Audrey thought about whether she'd meant it literally or whether she'd accidentally said something true by accident. She stared out the window and didn't raise the question out loud. Ronan was on his phone most of the drive. She watched the city lights and let the silence be. Vaughn came to her on day 6. He knocked at 7 in the morning, and when she opened the door, he came in without being asked, which told her it wasn't a social call. He sat down at the guesthouse kitchen table, and she poured him coffee without thinking about it, and he said, Warren had someone watching the gallery reception. I figured, not surveillance, someone inside, a guest. She sat down. Who? Doesn't matter right now. What matters is they were watching specifically see how you two interacted when you didn't think anyone was looking. She thought back. The moments between conversations. The way she'd stood near Ronan without standing too close, without standing too far. The drink she'd gotten for him without being asked, because she'd noticed his glass was empty. The minute he'd put his hand at her back again, and the minute she'd leaned fractionally. What did they see? She asked. Vaughn looked at her with the measured expression of a man who chose his words by weight. Something that looked convincing enough that Warren's contact had to look more carefully. That's good. Possibly. He turned his coffee cup a quarter turn. The other thing. Warren sent someone to your apartment building. Every muscle in her body went tight. Not to Penny, Vaughn said immediately. To your neighbor. An older woman, Mrs. Chen. She lives across the hall. Mrs. Chen, who had a key to their apartment for emergencies. Mrs. Chen, who had watched Penny 3 times when Audrey had late events and brought them soup when Penny got a flu in February. Mrs. Chen, who knew their entire lives, because that's what neighbors in that building knew about each other. The walls were thin and the lives were parallel. What did she tell them? Audrey said. Her voice was very flat. She said you were a good neighbor and a good sister, and she was happy you'd finally met someone. Vaughn paused. She had no idea she was being interviewed. What did they ask her? About the engagement specifically. When you'd mentioned it. Whether she'd met him. Audrey pressed her fingers to her forehead. And she said you'd mentioned meeting someone a few months ago, but that you were private about it. Didn't bring it home. She said that you tended to keep your personal life separate from Penny because you didn't want Penny getting attached to someone before you were sure. The silence that followed had a particular texture. That actually helps us, Vaughn said carefully. I know it does. Audrey pulled her hand away from her face. She's a 74-year-old woman who got used without knowing it. That's what I'm sitting with. Vaughn didn't minimize it. He just let it sit. How do we make sure it doesn't happen to Penny? She said. Ronan moved someone onto your block yesterday. Discreet. She'll be watched. Without asking me. He authorized it the same night he authorized your guest house. He should have told you. A pause. I should have told you sooner. Splon. She thought about what it meant that Ronan had made a decision that involved her sister without consulting her, even if the decision was protective. She thought about how she felt about that, and found that her feelings about it were complicated, in a way she didn't have time to fully unpack right now. Tell him I need a conversation, she said. He's in a meeting until noon. After noon, then. The conversation happened in the garden, which was not where she'd expected it. She'd expected the study. He was there when she came out, jacket off, sleeves pushed up, sitting on a stone bench near the back wall, like a man who had been informed he was about to have a difficult conversation and had decided to have it somewhere he could breathe. Vaughn told me you knew, he said before she could start. He told me this morning. You've had someone on my block since day one. Yes, you didn't ask. No, he met her eyes. I made the call and it was the right call. Asking would have cost time I didn't have, and produced a conversation about your comfort with a situation that was already in motion. So you just decided. I decide things quickly. That's not going to change. His voice wasn't defensive. It was just factual, the way a boulder is factual. I'm sorry I didn't tell you sooner. That should have happened. She looked at him. The apology was real brief, without cushioning, and she'd learned in 4 days of watching him operate that he didn't pad things. When he said something, it was what he meant. Don't make decisions about Penny without telling me, she said. I don't care how fast. Tell me after, if not before. She's not a variable you manage. She's my sister. Something moved in his expression, not irritation. More like acknowledgement of a boundary he'd walked through without checking for it first. Understood, he said. She sat down on the bench across from him. The garden was quiet. Somewhere in the house behind them, a phone rang and went to silence. Mrs. Chen, she said, I know. Warren used a 74-year-old woman who has no idea she was being used. Warren uses what's available. His jaw tightened. He's careful enough to never cross into anything that can be named directly. He gets information from people who don't know they're providing it. He puts pressure on points that don't look like pressure from the outside. He looked at his hands. He's done it before, to people I was responsible for. The specific weight of the last sentence made her look at him. The 3 employees, she said. It came out before she'd decided to say it. Vaughn had mentioned them in passing during the background briefing. 3 people, 3 years ago, killed during a period of instability in the organization. Details deliberately vague. Ronan went very still. How much did Vaughn tell you? He said. Almost nothing. Just that they existed. He was quiet for a moment. The garden held its own sounds wind, a bird somewhere past the wall. He didn't look like a man who was going to tell her the story. He looked like a man deciding whether the story was a thing he owed her. They were good people, he said finally. Who died? Because information got out that shouldn't have. Someone's inside the organization passed it to the wrong people, and those 3 were in the wrong place when the consequences arrived. He paused. I go to their graves every month, not because it accomplishes anything, because they're owed that much. Who passed the information? The pause this time was longer. Geneva Lockwood, he said. Who was, at that point, someone I had let close enough to know things she shouldn't have known. The weight of that settled on Audrey like something physical. She sat with it. She understood now what Warren's marriage campaign actually was not just politics, not just alliance building. It was the return of someone who had already burned a hole in Ronan's life once, arriving back under the cover of legitimacy, positioned by a father who had decided that the best move was to press the wound open again and see what came out. And you still haven't, she started. No direct action without proof that would hold in front of the council. He looked at her. That's the constraint I work in. Not law, but rules that exist for the same reasons law does, more or less. She thought about the 3 graves, about a man in his mid-30s visiting them every month, not because it fixed anything, but because they were owed that much. She thought about the drafting table and the paper that was face down. What's on the drafting table, she said. He blinked. It was the first time she'd seen him actually caught off guard by a direct question. What? In your study. The paper that's face down on the drafting table. I've noticed it twice. He looked at her for a long moment with the expression of someone recalculating who they're talking to. Building plans, he said. Rough, nothing finished. Design studied architecture. Before. He stopped. Before your father. Yes. She didn't push it. She could feel the shape of what was there without needing to excavate it. A person who had been pointed in one direction, and then had the ground entirely removed and had redirected with the kind of efficiency that looks like choice from the outside and costs considerably more from the inside. Okay, she said. He looked at her like he'd expected more. What? Nothing. You just said okay because it makes sense. She stood, brushing off her jeans. I won't mention it again unless you bring it up. She started toward the guest house, and he said, Audrey. She turned. The money from the scholarship fund comes out of what the Blackridge Foundation would list as administrative overhead. No family name attached. It goes to 11 kids this year. He said it looking straight at her. 7 of them are the first in their families to finish high school. She didn't know why he was telling her. She thought maybe he didn't entirely know either. That's good work, she said. He nodded once and looked away. Day 11. Warren called Ronan directly. She wasn't supposed to hear the conversation. She was in the kitchen of the main house, picking up files, Constance had asked her to review background on the Blackridge Foundation's charitable initiatives, material that would help her answer questions at their next public appearance, when Ronan came in mid-call, phone against his ear, and stopped when he saw her. He didn't leave. She stayed where she was. I'm happy to meet, Ronan said into the phone. His voice was the same as it always is, which meant it was impossible to read. Wednesday, not at my office. The club on Marlborough. Noon. A pause. Bring whoever you need to bring, Warren. It doesn't matter to me. He hung up. He wants a meeting, Audrey said. He wants to look at us in a controlled environment he chose. He'll bring someone whose job is to watch you, specifically, while he talks to me. What do we do? Ronan set his phone on the counter. We go. We're exactly what we've been presenting. We give him nothing he can use. He's going to have information from Mrs. Chen. Yes. And from whoever was at the gallery. Yes. And he's going to try to find the edge of where the story doesn't hold. That's correct. Ronan looked at her. So we don't give him an edge. She thought about Wednesday. She thought about sitting across a table from Warren Lockwood in a private club he'd chosen, because choosing the location meant he got to control the architecture of the encounter. She thought about Geneva, who may or may not also be present. He's going to ask about things we haven't covered yet, she said. Probably. We should cover them. He looked at her for a second. Then he went to the coffee maker, her coffee maker, the one she'd been using all week, which apparently he'd noted, and poured himself a cup without asking. He sat down to the kitchen table, and she sat down across from him, and they spent the next 2 hours doing something that felt, from the outside, like a couple talking, filling gaps, establishing details, exchanging the kind of information that people who love each other carry casually, and people who are performing love have to build deliberately. He told her about his father. She told him about her mother. He told her about 3 cities he'd lived in before settling back in Boston after his father's death. She told him about the 8 months after her mother died. Penny was 11 and Audrey was 24, and the whole mechanism of their lives had needed to be rebuilt from scratch on a salary that barely covered the original costs, let alone the new ones. Splitting. He listened to the Penny story without interrupting, which was unusual in her experience. Most people interrupted because they were waiting for the opening to say something about their own experience of loss, and Ronan just listened, his coffee going slightly cold in front of him, his eyes on her face. She sounds like someone who held you together as much as you held her, he said when she finished. Audrey had never framed it that way. She sat with it. Yeah, she said. She does. They weren't rehearsing anymore by the end of it. That was the thing she carried back to the guest house, the awareness that somewhere in the 2 hours, the preparations had stopped being preparation and become something else, and she hadn't noticed the moment it crossed. Wednesday arrived gray and cold. The club on Marlborough was the kind of establishment that had no signage visible from the street. You had to know it was there to find it, which was the entire point. Audrey had worn a charcoal dress and her own heels this time, and she'd made that decision specifically. This was hers, not a costume Constance had arranged. Ronan noticed. He didn't say anything, but he looked at her when she came to the car, and something in his expression registered the distinction. Warren was already seated when they arrived, which was also the entire point. Geneva was with him, and across the table from Geneva was someone Audrey didn't recognize, a woman in her 50s, compact, sharp-eyed, who had the specific quality of someone who had spent decades watching people for a living. Warren stood for the greeting, effusively warm, the way he always was, the warmth running on a different track entirely from whatever was happening behind it. "Audrey," he said, taking her hand, "you look wonderful." "Thank you, Warren." She smiled at him with the same warmth on the same separate track. They sat. The woman across from Geneva was introduced as a business associate named Marion. Marion said very little for the first 15 minutes and watched everything. Warren asked about the foundation work. Ronan answered. Warren asked Audrey about her event background, specifically about a charity she'd coordinated for 3 years ago that was connected, tangentially, to a social circle that overlapped with the Blackridge family. It was too specific to be casual. He'd researched it. He'd found the thread and pulled it to see if she'd been placed in Ronan's orbit earlier than she was claiming. "The Harrington Gala," Audrey said. "Yes, I ran that in 2021 and 2022. I don't think we overlapped that year." She looked at Ronan. "We didn't," Ronan said. "I didn't attend in either of those years." He looked at Warren. The Harrington Foundation shifted their focus in a direction that didn't align with ours. "We reduced our participation." Warren nodded pleasantly. Filed. Geneva spoke to Audrey for the first time across the table. "Do you plan to continue working after the marriage?" "Yes." No hesitation. "I'm moving into the Foundation's event programming. It makes sense given my experience, and it's work I care about." "Is that a formal arrangement?" "It's what we've decided." Audrey glanced at Ronan with the specific comfort of someone who has had this conversation privately and is simply reporting the conclusion. Ronan met her glance. "Yes," he said simply. Geneva held her composure beautifully. There was something underneath it that Audrey could see because she'd been watching Geneva across tables for 2 weeks now, and she'd learned the tells the way Geneva's eyes moved when she was recalibrating. The way she'd be still for a half second too long before she reached for her water glass. Marion, the silent observer, had been studying Audrey the entire time. Audrey knew this because she was doing the same thing to Marion, while appearing to do nothing of the sort. Marion's attention wasn't hostile. Exactly. It was analytical. She was looking for the seam, the place where the performance ended and the real person began. The problem was Audrey was starting to have trouble finding that seam herself. Warren moved to the thing he'd been saving. He set down his fork with the careful placement of a man making a statement and said, "I understand there was a period recently where things were financially difficult for you, Audrey." Between positions, the table became very quiet. "Yes," she said. She said it the way she'd say, "The sky is blue." That must have been stressful. Particularly with your sister depending on you. It was hard. She held his gaze. "I won't pretend otherwise. Penny and I have navigated harder things. And then you met Ronan, and then I met Ronan." She let a beat pass, precisely calibrated. "Although I want to be clear that Ronan's financial position was not the attraction. I spent 8 months trying to decide whether I could trust someone who lives the way he lives. The money made that more complicated, not simpler." Warren blinked, just once. She'd taken his implication and turned it back into something that sounded authentic. Because it was actually a real thing. The money had always been both the reason and the complication. That was true. And truth had a particular sound that Warren Lockwood was experienced enough to recognize when it crossed his path. He moved on, but Marion was still watching Audrey. And Marion's expression had shifted by a degree not warmer, but more considered. Like someone who had gone looking for a fissure and found the rock went deeper than anticipated. The lunch ended with Warren's usual warmth. Handshakes, pleasantries, the theater of a cordial conclusion to a meeting that had been anything but. In the car going back, Ronan said Marion Webb. She used to work for an intelligence firm before Warren retained her privately. Her specialty is identifying deception in interpersonal scenarios. She wasn't sure, Audrey said. No, she wasn't. A pause. You turned the financial question, he said. It was true. He looked at her. Which part? She looked out the window at the gray Boston afternoon. All of it. He didn't respond to that. The car moved through the city, and the silence between them was not the silence of nothing. It had mass and texture, and it sat between them for the rest of the drive home. Day 18. Penny came on a Saturday. Audrey had arranged it carefully, a visit framed as seeing where Audrey was staying while she was working with the foundation. A normal Saturday, nothing that would read as strange. Ronan had been told. Constance had arranged to be present briefly and then absent, with the instinctive social intelligence of a woman who understood when presence helped and when it didn't. Penny was 16 tall for it, with their mother's brown eyes and her own specific way of looking at the world, direct interested, entirely unintimidated by things that would have intimidated most people her age. She walked into the Blackridge estate the way she walked into everything, which was by looking at it thoroughly and then deciding what she thought. She shook Ronan's hand. He looked slightly surprised. People Penny's age usually didn't shake hands. Audrey says you run a scholarship program, Penny said. Yes, Ronan said. For disadvantaged students. Correct. What's the selection criteria? He told her. Audrey watched Ronan explain the scholarship program structure to a 16-year-old girl who was listening with the focused attention of someone who was actually processing it rather than politely waiting for her turn to speak. Penny asked 2 follow-up questions. Ronan answered them, without the slight condescension people usually folded into their explanations of complicated things to teenagers. At lunch, when Ronan stepped away to take a call, Penny looked at Audrey across the table and said, Okay. Okay, what? Okay, I see it. She stabbed her salad. You didn't look at him weird while he was talking. How do I look at him? Like you're trying not to look at him a specific way. Penny ate her forkload of salad, which is somehow more convincing than if you were just looking at him normally. You're 16, ton. I'm observant. She pointed her fork. He watches you when you're not looking. I clocked it 3 times during lunch. Audrey set down her water glass. We're being careful, she said. Both of us. It's a complicated situation. Is complicated a word? Yes, Audrey said. It is. Penny was quiet for a moment. Then she said, he guaranteed my college before he ever met me. That's the detail I can't get past. I know. That's not something you do as a transaction, Audrey. I know that too. The sound of Ronan's voice came from the corridor, still on the call, the low, controlled tone that didn't change regardless of who he was talking to. Penny tracked the sound and then looked back at her sister. Just don't do the thing where you convince yourself it isn't what it obviously is, she said. I'm not convincing myself of anything. Good. Penny reached across and took a piece of bread from the basket. Because I already like him. Which means you're going to have to make good decisions. The call came on the morning of day 23. Audrey was in the guest house. 7:40 in the morning, coffee in hand, reviewing the foundation's upcoming event calendar, when her phone buzzed with Penny's number. She answered immediately. Hey, I was just about to. Is this Audrey Whitcomb? The voice was not Penny's. It was a man's voice, measured and familiar, in the way something becomes familiar the moment you understand what represents. Warren Lockwood. Where is my sister? Audrey said. Her voice came out very flat, the flatness of someone suppressing something that would be counterproductive to let out. Your sister is at school, Warren said pleasantly. She's fine. She lent me her phone briefly, before classes started to give us a chance to speak privately. She lent, Audrey stopped. What did you ask her? Just some questions. Getting to know you things. She's a bright girl. Very forthcoming. The coffee cup was in her hand, and she set it down on the counter because she was squeezing it, and the pressure was excessive. She mentioned, Warren continued, still pleasant, still warm the way a surface can be warm before you find out what's underneath it, that she'd never heard Ronan's name until a few weeks ago. Just before the dinner party at the Blackridge estate. Isn't that interesting? Audrey did not say anything. It raised some questions for me, Warren said, about the timeline, about what the nature of this arrangement actually is, about what a court might find if someone decided to look carefully at the way this engagement came together. A pause. About what the council might find. Still nothing from Audrey. I think, Warren said, that you and Ronan should meet me this evening. The old harbor facility on Commercial Street, 8 o'clock. Come alone, just the two of you. I believe we have things to discuss that require some privacy. And if we don't come, then I start sharing what I've learned. Beginning with the council. He let that land. 8 o'clock, Audrey. It's a simple meeting. Nobody needs to get hurt. The call ended. Audrey stood in the guest house kitchen. The coffee she'd set down was steaming gently. The event calendar was open on the table. Outside, the garden was gray and quiet. She called Ronan. He picked up on the second ring. Warren called me on Penny's phone, she said. He talked to her at school this morning. She told him she'd never heard your name until a few weeks ago. She stopped. He wants to meet tonight. Harbor facility on Commercial Street. 8 o'clock. He's threatening to take what he has to the council. A silence on Ronan's end. Not the silence of surprise. The silence of someone whose calculation has just changed significantly in a direction they were hoping to avoid. Don't call Penny back yet, he said. I'll have Vaughn reach the school to confirm she's safe. He said he didn't hurt her. He didn't, but I'm confirming anyway. A pause. We're going to the meeting. You're sure? Yes. His voice carried the weight of someone who has decided and will not be undecided. I want you to go back to the main house. Don't be alone in the guest house until I've made some calls. I'll come find you. She picked up the coffee. Put it down again. Ronan. Yeah. She's 16 years old. He went to her school and used her phone. She said it quietly, not with anger, but with the particular steadiness of a woman who has been protecting someone smaller than herself for 5 years and has just watched something get past the wall she built. I need you to understand what that means to me. Another silence. Longer this time. I understand, he said, and in the way he said it, not performatively, not with the cushioning people put around things she believed him. She walked to the main house. Somewhere across the city at 8 o'clock there was a meeting waiting for them at a harbor warehouse. And it was not the kind of meeting either of them could refuse to attend. And it was going to change the shape of everything that came after. Ronan found her in the main house sitting room at 8:15 in the morning, not because she'd sat down intentionally, but because her legs had made the decision for her somewhere between the hallway and the window. She was standing when he came in, which was better, because sitting would have felt like waiting, and she didn't want to feel like she was waiting for something she couldn't control. He came in without knocking, which she'd stopped registering as unusual 3 days ago. He looked at her face and didn't say anything immediately, which she'd also started to understand was his way of taking inventory before he spoke. Penny's in class, he said. Vaughn confirmed it. She's safe. Audrey exhaled the phone. Ronan came further into the room. Warren approached her before school. Outside the building, not inside. He introduced himself as a business associate of mine, which she had no reason to question. He asked her some questions about the engagement. She answered them honestly, and he borrowed her phone to make what he told her was a quick call. He stopped about 6 feet from her. She didn't know. She had no way to know. I know she didn't know. Audrey pressed the heel of her hand against her sternum briefly, a gesture she made sometimes when the pressure inside got specific. That's not what I'm sitting with. What are you sitting with? That he walked up to a 16-year-old girl outside her school and used her the same way he used Mrs. Chen, casually, like she was just another resource he had access to. She looked at him. He's telling us he can reach anything we care about. That's the message. Ronan's jaw was set in the way it got when he was containing something significant. Yes, that's the message. And the meeting tonight is the delivery mechanism. He moved to the window. Outside, Constance's garden was colorless. In the November morning, everything stripped back to structure. He has enough now to raise questions in front of the council. Penny's statement about the timeline directly contradicts the engagement narrative. He'll use that as leverage. What does he actually want? Ronan turned from the window. He wants me to reconsider the Lockwood alliance. On his terms. Tonight's meeting is where he presents the cost of not reconsidering. And if we go on the front foot. We don't wait for him to take this to the council without our side of it established first. She thought about the Harbor Warehouse, Commercial Street, 8 o'clock. The specific language Warren had chosen, nobody needs to get hurt, which was the language of a man telling you exactly where the ceiling was without specifying the floor. I'm going in with you, she said. I haven't said you're not. You have a tendency to make those decisions for people and inform them afterward. He looked at her, a beat. You're coming, he said. The day moved the two-way. Days move when you're waiting for an evening you can't stop from coming. Vaughn ran through logistics in the afternoon, the location, what they knew about the facility, who Warren was likely to bring. Constance sat at her dining room table through the briefing and said nothing, which was its own form of communication. She was a woman who had spent 40 years inside this machinery, and her silence now was not ignorance. A particular stillness of someone who understood that certain situations required burning through before they could be navigated around. After Vaughn left, Constance made tea. She set a cup in front of Audrey without asking and sat across from her who had decided a conversation needed to happen regardless of whether it was comfortable. You're frightened, Constance said. I'm concerned about Penny. That's not the only thing you're frightened about. Audrey looked at the tea. I don't know what I'm doing here. In the general sense, she said it carefully. I came in for one dinner. I understood the parameters. And now we're driving to a harbor meeting tonight because Warren Lockwood has enough to potentially destroy the arrangement. And I'm sitting here trying to figure out when this stopped being something I could walk away from cleanly. Constance turned her teacup 1/4 turn. Ronan hasn't had someone in this house in 6 years. Someone present. Eating in this kitchen, in the garden, in the study. She looked at Audrey. He moves people through his life at a controlled distance. It's not coldness. It's what happens to a person when they learn that proximity costs. I know what it is. I think you do. Constance set the cup down. That's the thing that worries me, actually. Not in a bad way. More in the way that a situation has become more complex than its original parameters. And complexity is where people get hurt when they aren't careful. Audrey looked at her directly. Are you warning me off? No. Constance met her eyes steadily. I'm telling you that whatever you decide about what this is or isn't, do it honestly. To yourself first. The rest of it will follow from that. The afternoon light shifted outside. Somewhere in the house, a clock ticked. He has architectural drawings on the drafting table, Audrey said. Constance's expression changed in a way that was very small and very significant. He showed you. I noticed them. He told me what they were. He hasn't drawn anything in 4 years. Constance looked at her hands. Not since the last time the organization hit a crisis that took everything he had. He used to draft things constantly when he was younger. Buildings he'd never build, mostly. It was how he thought. Audrey held on to that. At 6:30 she called Penny. Penny answered immediately, which meant she'd been holding the phone. I'm so sorry, she said before Audrey could say anything. I didn't know who he was. He said he worked with Ronan, and he seemed he was nice, Audrey. He was really normal seeming. I know, Audrey said. I know, you didn't do anything wrong. He took my phone and I just stood there like an idiot. Penny. Audrey kept her voice steady. You did nothing wrong. He's an adult who deliberately misrepresented himself to a teenager. That's on him, not you. I need you to hear that. A shaky exhale on the other end. Are you okay? Penny asked. Yes. Is Ronan? We're handling it. Audrey sat on the edge of the guest house bed. I need you to stay at the Nguyen's tonight. I already called Mrs. Nguyen. She's expecting you. Why? Because I'll be out late and I don't want you alone. Audrey Penny. Stay at the Nguyen's. Do your homework, eat her food, and I'll call you by 10 o'clock. Okay? A pause. Okay, I love you. I love you too. Another pause. Be careful. Audrey hung up. She sat on the edge of the bed for a moment and let herself have 30 seconds of something she didn't name. Then she stood up and put on her coat. The car to Commercial Street left at 7:20. Ronan sat beside her in the back. Vaughn drove. 2 other cars traveled parallel routes. She knew about the two other cars because Ronan had told her not asking, just informing, which was his version of consideration. The harbor in November was brutal, wind off the water that found every gap in your coat and meant it. The facility on Commercial Street was a working warehouse, or had been the kind of structure that remained standing after its original purpose was gone because demolition cost money, and someone always kept renewing the lease. High ceilings, concrete floor, the smell of salt water and cold metal. Warren was already inside. Of course he was. He'd brought 4 people. 2 stationed at the entrance, large, quiet. The kind of men whose presence was itself a statement, and 2 more visible in the interior. Geneva was not there, which was the first thing Audrey catalogued. She'd expected Geneva. The absence of Geneva felt like a door that was closed for a reason. Warren stood in the center of the space, like a man who had arranged the furniture of a room that didn't have any. He looked at Ronan first and then at Audrey, and his expression was the same one he always wore, warm, engaged, with something running underneath it that was neither. "I'm glad you came," he said. "You didn't give us much of a choice," Audrey said. Warren smiled at that. "I always give people choices. The choices just have different weights." Ronan stepped forward. "Say what you have to say, Warren." Warren put his hands in his coat pockets. He looked for a moment like a man deciding which door to open first, and then he made his choice. "The engagement is a fabrication," he said. "I have a statement from your sister." He looked at Audrey that she had never heard Ronan Blackridge's name until approximately 3 weeks ago. "The council dinner was your first meeting. The 8-month timeline doesn't exist." Penny didn't know what she was saying, Audrey said. She knew exactly what she was saying. She just didn't know why she was being asked. Warren turned to Ronan. "Your mother hired this woman from a hotel bar on the same evening as the dinner. $20,000 for one night, which became 60 for 3 months when the single evening wasn't sufficient. I have the financial transaction pending in your accounts, Ronan. The timing is not ambiguous. The warehouse was very cold." Audrey became aware of the sound of water somewhere waves against the structure's exterior, persistent and indifferent. "What do you want?" Ronan said. "I want what I've always wanted. A legitimate alliance between our families." Warren's voice was entirely reasonable. Geneva passed information to people who killed 3 of my employees," Ronan said. The sentence landed in the cold air and sat there. Warren's expression didn't change. That was the thing that told Audrey everything. A man who heard an accusation like that and didn't flinch had either heard it before or had already built his response. "That's a serious allegation," Warren said. "It's not an allegation. It's unproven, and it will remain unproven because there's nothing to prove." Warren held his ground with the ease of a man who had known this moment was coming and prepared for it long ago. "What I have is documented. The transaction, the timeline, the testimony. What you have is a story you've told yourself about something that happened 3 years ago to justify refusing a partnership that would benefit both our families." Something moved through Ronan's face. It wasn't quite anger. It was the thing underneath anger that anger is built on top of, which is more dangerous because it doesn't peak and recede the way anger does. "You're going to take this to the council," Ronan said. "Unless we reach an agreement tonight? Yes. I'll present what I have within the week." Warren spread his hands. "I take no pleasure in this, Ronan. I want an outcome where everyone benefits. The council will have questions about the fraudulent engagement. They'll have questions about your judgment and your mother's. But all of that goes away if we find a path forward." Audrey had been watching the 2 men visible in the warehouse interior. One was steady, experienced. He wasn't watching the confrontation. He was watching the entrance and the perimeter, which was professional posture. The other had his eyes on Ronan specifically, tracking him the way you track a variable you've been told might move unexpectedly. She was also watching the entrance. She moved, not dramatically. Just slightly to the left, 3 steps, which took her out of the direct line between Ronan and Warren and into the shadow of a stack of crates where she could see the structure's full interior without being the obvious focal point. Old event coordination instinct: position yourself so you can see the whole room. From there, she saw what she'd missed head on. There was a third figure in the warehouse. Standing back, far enough into the shadows that she'd have missed them straight on. Standing very still, the posture of someone who had been waiting for a specific moment rather than witnessing since an incidental one. Not Warren's security. The figure moved slightly, and the light from a high warehouse window caught a profile. Audrey's chest went cold. Marion Webb, Warren's analytical specialist. The woman from the club lunch who'd spent 2 hours watching Audrey's face and cataloging the seams. Marion was not there as a witness. Marion was holding a folder. Audrey looked at the folder and then back at Marion's face and understood, with the specific chill of a thing you understand in your body before your mind has finished processing it, that whatever was in that folder was the real reason for this meeting, and the conversation happening between Ronan and Warren was the theater running in front of it. "Ronan," she said. He turned. She looked at the shadows past his shoulder without pointing. Just looked. He tracked it. His eyes found Marion. Something in his face went very still. Warren turned to follow their attention, and his expression did something she hadn't seen it do before it shifted into something more real, the pleasant surface dropping for just a second to show what was underneath it, which was the satisfaction of a man whose move has been seen and who doesn't care because it's too late to matter. "Marion," Warren said, "go ahead." Marion walked forward into the light. She opened the folder, removed a single sheet, and set it on a wooden crate between them. She stepped back without speaking. Ronan looked at the sheet. Audrey moved to see it. It was a transaction record. Audrey recognized the format financial documentation, the kind that came from a forensic accounting review. She started writing from the top and was 4 lines in when the room stopped making the sounds it had been making, because the name at the top of the document was not a name she'd expected. It was Constance Blackridge, and the document detailed financial transfers that went back not 3 weeks, not 8 months, but 7 years. Audrey looked at the numbers. She looked at the transfer destinations. She looked at the dates. "What is this?" she said. Warren's answered before Ronan could. "Your future mother-in-law has been managing a secondary fund for almost a decade, separate from the official Blackridge accounts. Disbursements to approximately 19 individuals over 7 years." He paused. "Including 3 individuals who had a financial relationship with members of the Lockwood organization." Audrey looked at Ronan. His face was something she hadn't seen before. He was looking at the document, and he was very, very still, the stillness of a person encountering information that is rearranging a foundational structure. "That's not possible," he said. It came out quiet. "The documentation is complete," Marion said. Her voice was professional, uninflected. "The transfers are real. The timeline begins 7 years ago, and the most recent transaction occurred 4 months before the 3 deaths in your organization." The word 3 hit the warehouse air like a stone hitting water. Audrey watched Ronan's face. She had learned it well enough in 23 to read the things he didn't let surface, the way you learn to read weather from cloud shapes rather than waiting for the rain. What crossed his face now was not the cold contained control she'd come to know. It was something she hadn't seen in him yet, something rawer. He picked up the document. He looked at it for a long time. "The 3 employees," Audrey said quietly, standing beside him. He didn't answer. She looked at the document, at the timeline. 4 months before the 3 deaths. Financial transfers that connected the Blackridge family's private funds to people inside the Lockwood organization. She thought about Geneva, whom Ronan had blamed for 3 years. She heard it through Ford's. She thought about Constance, who had brought her to this situation, who had sat across a hotel bar and offered unearned $20,000 with the certainty of a woman who knew exactly what she was doing. She thought about what Penny had said. "That's not something you do as a transaction." "The scholarship fund," Audrey said. She said it low, just to Ronan, not for Warren. "Constance administers it." His jaw moved. "The 19 individuals in this document," she said. "Could any of them? I don't know," he said. His voice was barely audible. "Ronan, I don't know." He set the document back on the crate. He did not look at Warren. He looked at the far wall of the warehouse, at the dark space above the crates, at nothing. His hands were at his sides, and they were very still, but she could see the tendons in his forearms. Wolsound let the silence do its work. He was patient with it, in the way he was patient, with most things letting the situation apply its own pressure so that he didn't have to appear to apply it. "What do you want?" Ronan said again. His voice was different now. The subtle control was still there, but something underneath it had shifted, and the shift made it sound less like composure and more like a man speaking through something he was actively holding at bay. "The same thing I've always wanted," Warren said. "An alliance. Formalized. Through the marriage. And this document. Goes away. All of it. Marion's findings, the engagement documentation, everything." Warren looked at him. "This is a straightforward offer, Ronan. Better for your family than any alternative." Audrey was standing slightly behind Ronan's right shoulder. She could see the side of his face. She watched him process a thing that was larger than the warehouse, larger than Warren's offer, larger than any of the maneuvering that had been running for 3 weeks. She thought about Constance's face the morning she'd made tea. The things she'd said about Ronan, he moves people through his life at a controlled distance. It's what happens to a person when they learn that proximity costs. Said with such knowledge, such specificity. "You should go outside," Ronan said. He was talking to her. "No." He turned to look at her. "Audrey." She held his gaze. "Whatever happens in this room, I'm in it." Something crossed his face. He turned back to Warren. "I need to speak with my mother," he said. "Of course." Warren was entirely accommodating. "We're not going anywhere tonight." He called Constance from outside the warehouse, standing 20 feet from the entrance, with the harbor wind grinding against them both. Audrey stood beside him because she'd said she was in it, and she meant it, and also because she needed to hear whatever came next from the same position he did. Constance answered on the third ring. "Ronan," she said. Her voice was the same as always, contained. Warm, the voice of a woman who loved her son and was also capable of things he hadn't accounted for. "The transfers," he said. "Constance. 7 years. 19 individuals. The 4 months before Marcus and Daniel and Sean died." A silence. Not the silence of a person who didn't understand the question. "Where are you?" she said. "At the meeting you knew I was going to." He held the phone against his ear and his free hand went into his jacket pocket and made a fist that Audrey could see the tension of. "I need you to tell me what the document is." Another silence. "Longer, it's complicated," she said. "Tell me." "Ronan." "Tell me what the transfers are." His voice cracked the smallest amount on the second word and immediately sealed again, the way ice cracks and refreezes in the cold. "Because right now what I'm looking at is a document that says money from your private fund went to people inside the Lockwood organization 4 months before 3 people I was responsible for died because this information got out. And I need you to explain that to me." The wind off the water was relentless. "The transfers weren't to the Lockwood organization," Constance said. Her voice was careful now. "Some of those people had connections I wasn't aware of when I first." She stopped. "It's more complicated than what you're reading. Did you know that information was being passed to the people who killed them?" "No." Immediate, firm Ronan. "Not that, never that. But something was passing." A very long pause. "I was managing a relationship that I thought was contained. Information about certain business decisions that I believed were..." She stopped again. "I thought I was protecting the family. I was protecting you from decisions your father had made before he died. Decisions that would have come back with consequences worse than what happened." Ronan was very quiet for a moment. "And Geneva," he said. "Geneva was in the information chain. I didn't put her there intentionally. She found the connection through one of the individuals I was in contact with." Constance's voice was still controlled, but there was something underneath the control that sounded like a person standing at the edge of something. "I discovered it 2 months after Marcus and Daniel and Sean died. I have spent 3 years trying to find a way to tell you that didn't destroy everything you had left. The wind, the water, the cold. You let me blame Geneva," he said. "Geneva was not innocent. She used the connection she found. She passed information she knew would be dangerous. I didn't put her in the chain, but she chose to be in it. You let me believe she was the source. You needed somewhere to put it." Constance's voice broke on the last word, just slightly, just enough to be real. "You were carrying 3 graves, Ronan. I couldn't add mine." He lowered the phone. He stood there in the harbor wind, with the phone at his side, and Audrey beside him, and the warehouse at their backs, and the water somewhere past the dark, making its indifferent sound. She didn't touch him. She didn't speak. She stood close enough that he knew she was there, which was what the moment called for, and she let him have the silence he needed to process the thing that had just reorganized 37 years of understanding in the space of a phone call. After a while, she didn't track how long he raised the phone again. "Come to the estate," he said. "Now. Tonight. We're not done with this conversation." He paused. "And I need you to bring everything you have. Every document, every contact, every piece of this that you've been holding. All of it. Ronan, all of it, Constance." He ended the call. He stood for another moment. Then he turned and walked back toward the warehouse entrance, and Audrey moved with him and said nothing because there was nothing that needed saying, and because sometimes the most important thing you can do for a person is simply keep pace. Warren's face when they came back in was the face of a man who had expected one of two outcomes: agreement or escalation, and was prepared for either. He looked at Ronan and saw something he hadn't expected, which was a man who had absorbed a devastating blow and was still standing and was still thinking, and this recalibrated Warren's expression by a degree. "I need 3 days," Ronan said. "I'm not sure 3 days changes." 3 days, Warren. You've waited 7 years for an alliance. You can wait 3 days for an answer that isn't produced under duress, in a building that smells like fish and rust. His voice was entirely flat. Not hostile, just immovable. You want a real negotiation. Give me 3 days to have one. Warren looked at him. He looked at Audrey. He looked at Marion, who was standing near the crates with her folder and the specific discretion of someone who understood her role. 3 days, Warren said. Then I take what I have to the council, and the conversation becomes considerably less private. 3 days. Warren inclined his head. They left. In the car, Vaughn drove. Ronan sat with his phone on his knee and didn't use it. Audrey sat beside him and watched the harbor district slide past and thought about every piece of the last 3 weeks rearranging itself around a new center. After 10 minutes of silence, Ronan said, "Everything I thought happened 3 years ago. I know, Geneva was part of it. That's still true. But the source wasn't what I thought." "I know," he looked at her. His face in the car's dark was exhausted, in a way she hadn't seen in it before. Not the managed, working exhaustion of a man running a difficult organization. Something more fundamental. "I've been going to 3 graves every month for 3 years, he said. "And not knowing. You know now. I don't know what to do with it yet." "You don't have to know yet." She looked at him. "Constance is coming to the estate. You'll have the full picture by midnight." She paused. "And then we figure out what comes next." He looked at her for a moment. "You said we," he said. "I said we." He turned to the window. She watched his profile in the passing lights and thought about a woman in a hotel bar who'd had 2 glasses of something expensive and a termination letter and 63 days of delinquent rent, and had said yes to a stranger because the math didn't leave any other options. The math was entirely different now, and none of the new math was the kind she'd prepared for. Constance was at the estate when they arrived. She was in the sitting room. She had a briefcase Audrey had never seen her carry. She looked like a woman who had been carrying a specific weight for a very long time and had arrived at the moment where it came down. And the arrival of that moment was a relief and a catastrophe simultaneously. Ronan walked in and stopped 6 feet from her. They looked at each other the way people look at each other when they share a history, long enough that the current moment is haunted by every previous version of the room they're standing in. Constance opened the briefcase. She put 7 years of documentation on the coffee table. She began to explain. The original contact had been a lawyer who managed residual interests from Ronan's father's era, an era that predated Ronan's leadership and carried obligations. Constance had been trying to resolve quietly, without triggering the attention of either the council or the Lockwoods. Some of those obligations ran through individuals who had, without Constance's knowledge, also been doing business with Warren's organization. The information chain had grown without her seeing it, the way things grow in the dark, and by the time she understood the shape of it, Marcus and Daniel and Sean were dead, and Geneva had been the visible point of failure, and Constance had made the decision to let that stand because Ronan was already destroyed enough. She said all of this looking at her son. Ronan listened. He stood. He did not sit down during any of it. He asked 3 questions, each of them precise, each of them going to a specific point in the timeline he needed confirmed. Constance answered each one. When she finished, the room held the silence of a space that has just contained something very large. The council, Ronan said. Warren takes this to them in 3 days. With the engagement documentation and with whatever interpretation he puts on your fund transfers. Yes, he'll frame the transfers as evidence that the Blackridge family operates with hidden financial structures that cross into Lockwood territory. That's the most damaging interpretation, yes. Is there a less damaging one that's also true? Constance looked at him. The money was management of a legacy debt that predates your leadership. It was not collaboration with Warren's organization. The individuals involved have been out of both orbits for years. Can you prove that? With the full documentation, yes. To someone willing to look at it completely. The council won't be willing unless we give them a reason to look at it completely instead of at Warren's version. Ronan turned and looked at Audrey. She'd been standing near the door, not intruding, just present. He looked at her with the expression of a man at the beginning of a thought that he hadn't yet completed. The engagement, he said. It's documented as fraudulent, she said. Yes. Warren has the financial transaction, the timeline, Penny's statement. Yes. So going to the council to fight his version of the fund transfers means the fraudulent engagement is on the table too. Everything comes out. Everything comes out, he confirmed. She thought about that. She thought about what everything means in a room of powerful people who govern their world by their own specific rules and who do not respond well to being played. She thought about Ronan standing in front of those people with his mother's hidden fund and his fraudulent engagement and his 3 dead employees and a woman he'd hired from a hotel bar, and she thought about what was actually true inside all of that and what the true version of events looked like when it was told, honestly. We tell them the truth, she said. Constance looked at her. Ronan looked at her. Not Warren's version, and not a managed counter version. The actual truth. She came further into the room. Your mother hired me. It was fraudulent. The engagement started as a transaction. And then something happened that wasn't a transaction, and the council deserves to see that, because it's the part Warren doesn't have documentation for. That's an enormous risk, Constance said. Yes. Audrey looked at Ronan. But it's the only version that holds. Everything else has a seam Warren can find. The truth doesn't have a seam. Ronan looked at her for a long moment. The exhaustion in his face was still there, but something else was moving underneath it. Now, something that wasn't the managed distance she'd spent 3 weeks studying. You understand what you're walking into, he said. If we go in front of the council, everything about your life is exposed. Warren will make sure of it. I know. You don't owe me this. I know that too. She held his gaze. I'm not doing it because I owe you, she said. He was quiet for a moment. Constance had gone very still on the settee. 3 days, Ronan said. We have 3 days to build the true version of this into something that can stand in front of 7 people who have every reason to want the simpler story. Then we start tonight, Audrey said. He nodded. He looked at the documentation on the coffee table, 7 years of his mother's careful damage control, laid out in the fluorescent clarity of a situation with no remaining shelter, and then he looked at the woman who had walked into a hotel bar. 2 months ago, with rent she couldn't pay, and a sister she was trying to protect, and had somehow ended up here, at the center of everything, choosing to stay. 3 days, a council of 7, Warren's documented evidence, and a true story that was stranger and harder, and more human than anything he could have manufactured. And Audrey Whitcomb, who was supposed to have left clean after 90 days, standing in his sitting room at midnight and telling him they were going to walk into the hardest room either of them had ever entered and tell the absolute truth. He had no idea whether it would be enough. But he had run out of other options, and she was still there. And for the first time in longer than he could accurately measure, Ronan Blackridge made a decision that wasn't calculated at all. He decided to trust her completely. They worked through the night. Not romantically. not with the soft edges that the word night sometimes carries. They work the way people work, when the deadline is real and the cost of failure is specific at the dining room table, with Constance's documentation spread across every available surface. 3 laptops open, Vaughn moving in and out of the room with additional files pulled from the estate's secure archive, coffee going cold and getting replaced and going cold again. Audrey had managed corporate crisis communications for 2 of her 4 years as an event coordinator. She'd never called it that her title was coordinator, not strategist, but the work was identical. When the caterer didn't show, when the keynote speaker's flight was canceled 4 hours before a gala for 300 people, when the venue flooded, you took the actual situation, identified what was salvageable, built a true narrative around the salvageable parts, and presented it before anyone else got to define the disaster for you. She applied that now. She took Constance's documentation and Ronan's knowledge of the council's composition and Vaughn's intelligence about what Warren had actually filed versus what he was threatening to file, and she started building a sequence, not a defense, a sequence of true events that had a different shape than Warren's version. Ronan watched her work for 40 minutes without speaking. Then he pulled a chair to her side of the table and started working with her. They argued 3 times, productively. The first time about the order of disclosure, whether to address the fraudulent engagement or the fund transfers first. Audrey said engagement first, because leading with the harder personal engine demonstrated the kind of transparency that made everything following it more credible. Ronan said fund transfers first, because the financial documentation was more complex, and front-loading complexity before credibility was established was tactically wrong. They went back and forth for 7 minutes before Constance, from across the table, said flatly, "She's right," and Ronan looked at his mother with an expression that processed 3 different things simultaneously before he conceded. The second argument was about Geneva. "She was in the information chain," Audrey said. "That's true. Your mother's documentation shows it. But if you lead with that in front of the council, it looks like deflection. Like you're managing the story to position Warren's family as the real villains. She was part of why they died. I know, and the council can know it too. But it can't be the point you lead with. It has to be a fact that emerges from the full picture, not a strategic move." Ronan's jaw set. He looked at the documentation. He looked at the window, which was showing the first gray of dawn at the edges. "She's been in every room I've been in for 6 months," he said. "Because her father positioned her there. Knowing what she did." "I know." Audrey kept her voice steady. "That's an incredibly specific kind of cruelty. And the council will see it if we build the sequence correctly. But they have to arrive at it themselves. If we hand it to them, it's our argument. If they find it in the evidence, it's the truth." He was quiet for a moment. "You're good at this," he said, not with surprise. With the particular note of someone recognizing a capability they hadn't fully cataloged yet. "I've had a lot of practice," she said, "making things work when the ground is moving under me." The third argument was about Audrey herself, about how much of her personal circumstances to present the financial pressure, the termination, the rent. Penny and Ronan said he didn't want to expose that material if it wasn't necessary. Setson and Audrey said it was absolutely necessary because Warren would use it, and the only way to neutralize a weapon was to pick it up first. "It makes me look like I was bought," she said. "Yes. And then I explain what happened after I was bought. And that's the part Warren can't document." Ronan looked at her. "He'll try to make you look like exactly what you were hired to be." "He can try." She met his eyes. "I know the difference between what I started as and what I am now. If I can't make 7 people see it, then we lose. But I'd rather lose on the truth than win on a version that has a seam." He didn't argue after that. 2 days. Ronan spent them doing things she wasn't entirely privy to. Calls, meetings, Vaughn going in and out. She understood from the fragments she overheard that he was managing the organizational elements, ensuring that whatever happened at the council meeting didn't create a vacuum that Warren could fill with his own positioning. He was not just building a defense. He was simultaneously shoring up the structure of his authority so that a challenge to it had less ground to destabilize. She spent the 2 days building the sequence and learning the council. Vaughn gave her profiles, 7 representatives, 7 distinct relationships to the Blackridge and Lockwood families, and to each other. She read them the way she read event guest lists, not names and titles, but dynamics alliances, the social architecture that determined how information would move through the room. Who would be sympathetic to Warren? Who had existing grievances with the Lockwood family? Who prized organizational stability above personal loyalties? Who would make up their mind in the first 3 minutes and spend the remaining time looking for confirmation? She built the sequence around the skeptics. The sympathetic ones would come eventually. The skeptics were the council session. Penny texted daily. Audrey answered, honestly when she could, and deflected when she couldn't, which Penny accepted with the steady patience of a teenager who had grown up understanding that some information arrived on its own timetable. On the evening of the second day, Constance came to the guest house. She knocked, which Constance rarely did. Come in, Audrey said. Constance sat in the kitchen chair and folded her hands on the table and said, I owe you an apology. Audrey waited. When I found you in that bar, I was looking for someone desperate enough to say yes quickly and capable enough to manage the performance. I was not considering your life beyond what it could do for my son in that specific window. She looked at her hands. I have spent the last 2 days watching you build our case in that dining room, and it has become clear to me that I was significantly underestimating what I was asking of you. You were asking me to lie, Audrey said. Yes. And I said yes because I needed the money. Yes. So we both entered it as a transaction. Constance looked at her with an expression that Audrey recognized from certain clients she'd worked with, people who were used to being the most capable person in the room and occasionally encountered someone who made them recalculate. What happens after the council session? Constance said. Assuming it goes the way you're building it. What do you want? Audrey thought about it honestly. I don't know yet. Ronan will not make assumptions. He doesn't make assumptions about what people want. He waits to be told, and then he acts on it completely. Constance paused. I'm telling you this because he won't tell you himself. I know, do you? Audrey looked at the kitchen window. At the garden beyond it, dark now, the structure of it still visible in the ambient light from the house. He has architectural drawings on that drafting table, she said. He hasn't drawn in 4 years. He started again sometime in the last 3 weeks. She paused. I know what that means. Constance was quiet for a long moment. Don't break his concentration, she said finally. It wasn't a threat. It was something more specific, the instruction of a mother who had watched her son survive a loss of self that she felt responsible for and had spent years waiting to see reversed. I'm not planning to break anything, Audrey said. Constance stood. She put her hand briefly on Audrey's shoulder, an unusual gesture from a woman who was precise about contact, and then she left. Audrey sat in the kitchen for a while. Then she went to bed, because tomorrow was the council session, and she needed to be exactly as sharp as she'd promised Ronan she could be. The private club on Beacon Hill had been in the same location for 80 years, and in that time had managed the particular trick of being both extremely visible and completely unregistered in the public consciousness. The right people knew it existed. The wrong people had never heard of it. They arrived at 11 in the morning. Ronan wore a dark suit and no tie, which Audrey had noted was his version of a controlled statement, present and serious, without the formality that could read as supplication. She wore a deep gray dress and her own heels in the specific internal posture of someone who had decided what they were doing and was not going to be talked out of it by the sight of the room. The room was smaller than she'd pictured. A mahogany table, 8 chairs, 7 of them occupied. The 8th was for Warren, who had arrived before them, and was seated with the ease of a man who had been in this room many times and felt its architecture was familiar. Geneva was seated behind him, in the observer position, not a council member, present only as a representative of the Lockwood interests. The 7 representatives were what Vaughn's profiles had prepared her for, and simultaneously not what she'd expected, the way people always exceed their profiles. 2 of them she'd flagged as potential skeptics. 1 she'd identified as a probable early ally. The remaining 4 were genuinely uncertain quantities, which was both the best and worst scenario. It meant the session was real rather than predetermined, and real sessions could go either direction. Ronan sat. Audrey sat beside him. Constance, who had been permitted to attend as the financial documentation's primary source, sat on Ronan's other side. The council's senior representative, a man named Arthur Graves, 70, and carrying it in the particular way that suggested he had never once made a decision, quickly looked at both sides of the table and said, "Warren has filed a formal challenge regarding the Blackridge engagement and certain financial disclosures. Ronan, you've requested the opportunity to respond in full. We'll hear Warren's presentation first." Warren stood. He was precise. Audrey had expected that. He had the documentation organized and presented it in the sequence that did the most damage in the least time: engagement fraud first, fund transfers second. The implication that both represented a pattern of concealment that the council should weigh when considering the Blackridge family's fitness to operate with the independence they currently held. He put Penny's statement on the table. Audrey heard her sister's words, never heard his name, until a few weeks ago, read aloud in a formal setting by a man who had extracted them from a teenager outside her school and kept her face exactly where she needed it to be. He put the financial transaction timeline on the table. He put Marion's analysis on the table. Marion herself was not present, which meant Warren had assessed that her presence would read as excessive and had calibrated accordingly, which told Audrey something useful about how he was reading the room. He sat down. Graves looked at Ronan. Ronan stood, and then he did something that Audrey had argued for, and he had ultimately decided on himself, which was the reason it worked. He didn't look at the council first. He looked at Audrey. It was a brief look. 2 seconds. But it was the look of a man checking in with someone he trusts before he does something difficult, and it happened at the exact moment when every eye in the room was on him, and it said more about the truth of what existed between them than any documentation could. Then he looked at the council. "Everything Warren presented is accurate," he said. The room shifted. The engagement was fabricated. My mother hired Audrey Whitcomb from a hotel bar on the same evening as the dinner where she appeared as my fiancée. The 8-month timeline did not exist. The financial transaction Warren documented is real $60,000 for 3 months, which has not yet transferred because we are not 3 months in. He paused. "I'm telling you this before Warren's cross-examination because the truth of it is not in dispute, and treating it as though it were would be an insult to everyone in this room's intelligence." Graves had not moved. Neither had anyone else. "What is in dispute," Ronan continued, "is the interpretation. And the interpretation requires the full picture, which Warren's presentation deliberately did not provide." One of the skeptics, a man named Caldwell, 60, who had been watching Ronan with the expression of someone waiting for the first lie, leaned forward slightly. Not hostile, attentive. Ronan laid out the sequence. Constance's fund, the legacy debt from his father's era, the containment effort, the individuals involved and their connections, documented and traceable to a period that predated Ronan's leadership and involved obligations that would have created worse consequences if surfaced through official channels. He was precise, and he was not apologetic about the complexity of it, which was itself a form of credibility. People who are managing something genuinely complicated don't simplify it for comfort. Then Marcus and Daniel and Sean. He said their full names. He said them the way you say names that matter, not as evidence markers, but as people. He laid out what had happened 3 years ago, and then he laid out what the fund documentation showed about the information chain, and then he said the thing that changed the temperature of the room. "I have believed for 3 years that Geneva Lockwood was the source of the information that killed them." He looked at Warren. That belief was partially correct. Geneva was in the information chain. But she entered it through a connection that ran through my mother's legacy fund, not as an independent actor. Which means the full picture of what happened 3 years ago is more complicated than either side of this table has previously acknowledged. Warren's face did not change, but Geneva's did. Audrey was watching Geneva. She'd been watching Geneva since the session started, because Geneva's responses were the ones Warren couldn't fully control, and therefore the ones most likely to contain something real. Geneva's face at this moment went through something rapid and complicated, and the thing Audrey saw, underneath the surface management, was not the guilt of a perpetrator. It was something closer to relief. She filed that. Graves said, What are you asking the council to find? I'm asking the council to look at the full documentation before drawing conclusions about the fund transfers. And I'm asking the council to consider Warren's challenge to the engagement in the context of what the engagement actually became, which is not the same as what it started as. That's a distinction you'll need to substantiate, Graves said. Yes, Ronan said. He sat down. Audrey, she stood. She had prepared for this. She had built the sequence. She had rehearsed the architecture of it. She decided where the true things lived and in what order they were most honestly presented. And then she stood up in front of 7 people she didn't know, in a room that could go in any direction, and she looked at them and the preparation fell away, and she just talked. She told them about the bar, about being fired and behind on rent and trying to protect a 16-year-old girl who trusted her to figure it out. She told them she said yes to $20,000 in a situation she didn't fully understand because the math of her life didn't leave another option. She told them what the first dinner was like, the terror of it, the improvisation, the moment when Ronan took her hand in the entryway because there wasn't time for anything else, and told her to make them believe it. She told them about Warren's investigator watching the gallery reception and Marion at the club lunch, and the specific relentless pressure of being examined by people looking for the seam. And somewhere in that pressure, she said, I stopped performing. The room was very quiet. I don't know when it happened. I've tried to identify the exact moment, and I can't. It wasn't one conversation or one evening. It was the accumulation of someone who had spent years making decisions entirely alone, suddenly being in a situation where someone else was thinking about the same problems at the same times. She looked at the table surface. He guaranteed my sister's college education before he ever met her. He did it because she was someone I was responsible for, and he understood what that meant without having to be told. That's not something you manufacture for an audience. She looked up. I came in as a transaction. I'm standing here because I chose to be. She held Graves's gaze. Those are different things, and I believe the council is experienced enough to tell the difference. She sat down. The room held its silence for a moment. Warren said, the substance of the fraud is not altered by... I have a question, said Caldwell. He was looking at Audrey. The 16-year-old, your sister, she was approached by Warren's people at her school. Yes. Before she could be briefed on the situation. Yes. She didn't know what she was being asked or why. Caldwell looked at Warren. It wasn't a friendly look. Warren, he said, you approached a minor at her school to extract testimony for a council challenge. Warren's composure held. I had a conversation with a young woman in a public location. At her school, Caldwell said, before classes, through a misrepresentation of your identity and purpose. The conversation was entirely voluntary. We'll note that, Graves said. And the way he said it flat, final, the way a stone is flat, and final told Audrey that the note was not a neutral one. Warren recalibrated. She could see him doing it the micro-adjustment of a man whose move has cost more than anticipated, deciding in real time whether to advance or hold. He advanced. The question of the engagement's authenticity remains, he said. Whatever emotional development may have occurred subsequently, the fact of the fraud is documented. The Blackridge family deliberately deceived a council-recognized gathering. The precedent of allowing, I'd like to speak, said Constance. Graves looked at her. You're not a council member. No. But the financial documentation being discussed is mine, and I believe the council deserves to hear from the source directly, rather than through interpretation. She paused. If you'll permit it. Graves considered. He looked at the other 6. A silent accounting happened across the table. Briefly, Graves said. Constance stood. She was 63. And she stood the way she always stood, with the posture of a woman who had made very difficult decisions and had lived with the weight of them and was not going to pretend otherwise. She looked at the 7 people at the table, and she said what she'd told Ronan in the estate's sitting room, cleanly and without softening. The legacy debt, the containment effort, the individuals she'd managed without fully understanding their other connections. The moment 3 years ago when she understood what the chain had cost and chose to let Geneva remain the visible cause because her son was already carrying more than she could watch him carry. That was the wrong choice, she said. I made it because I was protecting him from something I caused. I am presenting the full documentation now because it's what the council deserves, and because my son asked me for everything, and he was right to ask." She sat down. The silence afterward was different from the previous ones. It had a different texture, heavier, more considered. Warren looked like a man whose carefully arranged structure had developed a significant problem and was deciding which load-bearing element to prioritize. He looked at Geneva. Geneva was looking at the table. Warren said, "The emotional testimony of the parties directly involved does not address the documented fraud." "No," Graves said, "it doesn't." He looked at Ronan. "What do you propose as a resolution?" Ronan stood. "The engagement stands, not as a fraud and not as a transaction." He looked at Audrey briefly. "As the thing it became, regardless of how it started. I'm asking the council to recognize it as a genuine declaration by both parties, made voluntarily, made in this room in front of witnesses, and to find that Warren's challenge, having been built on evidence extracted from a minor through misrepresentation, carries less weight than he has claimed." Graves said, "A declaration made here would need to be formalized." "Then we formalize it," Ronan said. Warren stood sharply. "You can't be serious. You're going to marry someone you hired." Warren Graves's voice was quiet and absolute. "Sit down." Warren sat. His face was doing something. Audrey hadn't seen it do in all the sessions and dinners and confrontations. It was losing its management. The warmth was gone. Underneath was a man who had built a very complex structure and was watching the load redistribute in a direction he hadn't engineered. Graves looked at Audrey. "Ms. Whitcomb," he said, "I want to ask you directly, not as part of any strategy. Not for the record." He paused. "Is this what you want?" The room was entirely still. Ronan was standing to her left. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the table, and she understood the angle of it. He had placed the question in the room and was refusing to look at her while she answered, because looking at her would be a form of pressure, and he was not willing to apply it. That was the moment, not the one with documentation or testimony or sequence. That specific moment, his refusal to look at her, was the one that answered the question before she'd said a word. She stood. "Yes," she said. Ronan turned. Warren said, "This is a performance." "It isn't," said one of the other council members, a woman named Reyes, who had said nothing for the entire session and spoke now with the authority of someone whose silence had been deliberate. "I've been in this kind of room for 30 years. I know the difference." Warren looked at Reyes. He looked at Graves. He looked at the table and did the accounting that Audrey could see him doing, who had moved, which direction, what the remaining options were. He looked at Geneva. Geneva was still looking at the table. "Geneva," he said. She raised her eyes. Father and daughter looked at each other across the room, with the specific weight of two people who have arrived at a place where the same loyalty means different things to each of them. "This isn't what you want," Warren said to her. It was the first thing he'd said in the session that sounded entirely real. Geneva held his gaze for a moment. Then she looked at Ronan. "I knew about the connection," she said. Her voice was quiet and even, and she said it to the room rather than to any single person. "The individuals in your mother's fund. I found the chain 3 years ago and I used it because I thought..." She stopped. "Rebuilt. My father told me the alliance was the priority. I thought the information would create pressure that would advance the negotiation." She paused. "I didn't know people would die." The room absorbed it. "Geneva," Warren said. His voice had changed. "They have it in the documentation anyway," she said to her father. "The chain is there. I'm not going to sit here and let it be found around me when I can say it myself." She looked at the council. "I was 27. I was following a directive I didn't fully understand. That doesn't make it right. It makes it true." Warren sat back in his chair. For the first time in 6 weeks of watching him, he looked like a man who had not anticipated the next thing that was going to happen. Graves looked at the 7 representatives. Another silent accounting. "We'll recess for 30 minutes, he said. The corridor outside the session room was narrow and high-ceilinged, the kind of architecture that made voices carry farther than you intended. Ronan and Audrey stood near the window at the corridor's end. Constance had gone to find water. Vaughn was at the building's entrance. Warren came out of the session room. He stopped when he saw them. He looked at Ronan, then at Audrey, then at the middle distance. She was 27, he said. She made a choice I put her in a position to make. Ronan looked at him. I know what I did, Warren.
Sit.
I know what the fun chain was, and I know what it cost. He said it without the warmth, without the performance. Just a man in a corridor saying a true thing with nothing left to dress it in. It was never supposed to cost that, but it did, Ronan said. Yes. They stood in the corridor, and the weight of 3 years and 3 graves, and every move that had been made in the space between, was in the air around them. I want the alliance, Warren said. That has always been true. I want it because it's good strategy, and because the alternative families fighting across this city for the next 20 years is worse for everyone. He paused. But I've been running this the wrong way. Ronan was silent. Whatever the council decides today, Warren said, I'm withdrawing the formal challenge. The documentation, Marion's analysis, all of it. He looked at Audrey. The minor situation was wrong. I knew it when I did it, and I did it anyway. That's on me. Audrey looked at him. She thought about Penny standing outside her school building, handing her phone to a stranger because he seemed normal, and said he worked with Ronan. Don't approach my sister again, she said. Ever. For any reason. No, Warren said. I won't. He went back into the session room. Ronan stood at the window and exhaled, long and slow, the exhale of a man whose body has been at maximum tension for 72 hours and has just found the first gap in the pressure. Audrey stood beside him. He's going to withdraw it, she said. Yes. Does that change what happens in the session? He turned to look at her. His face was still exhausted. The cut on his lip from the warehouse, she noticed it now. She hadn't clocked when it had happened. Sometime in the warehouse encounter she'd missed. It was mostly healed, now caught the corridor light. Graves will still require a formalization, he said. I know. A declaration made in front of the council carries obligation. It isn't revocable the way a business arrangement is. She looked at him. At the exhaustion in his face, and the thing underneath the exhaustion that she'd been watching move progressively closer to the surface for 3 weeks. Ronan, she said. Yeah. Said yes in there because I meant it. Not for the council. Not for the strategy. She held his gaze. I need you to know that's separate from the $60,000, which I'm also keeping. Something moved in his face that was the closest thing to a smile she'd seen from him in 3 days. That's fair, he said. It is. He looked at her for a moment. His hand came up and he touched her jaw briefly, the lightest contact. The gesture of a man who has been precise about distance for weeks and has just made a different decision about it. The council is going to call us back in, he said. I know, and when they do. The door at the corridor's end opened. Vaughn, they're ready, he said. Ronan looked at Audrey. She looked back at him. Let's go finish it, she said. They walked back toward the session room together, and the corridor was narrow enough that their shoulders were close without touching, and the door was 10 feet away. And beyond it were 7 people, and a decision that was going to determine the shape of everything that followed. And Audrey Whitcomb, who had walked into a hotel bar with nothing and said yes to a stranger because the math demanded it, walked through the door without hesitating. Graves called the session back to order at 12:47 in the afternoon. The room was the same room it had been an hour earlier, but it felt different, the way rooms feel different after something real has happened in them. The air altered, the furniture somehow more present. Audrey sat down beside Ronan and put her hands flat on the table in front of her and breathed. Warren was already seated. His posture had changed. Not collapsed. Warren Lockwood was not a man who collapsed, but something in the architecture of how he held himself had shifted, the way a building shifts when a load-bearing assumption turns out to be wrong. Geneva sat behind him, looking at the middle Denton to the left, an expression of a sentence with the person who has just said an irreversible thing and is still processing the weight of having said it. Graves looked at Warren first. You've indicated you wish to modify your formal challenge. I'm withdrawing it, Warren said in full. A beat around the table. Not surprise, exactly the 30-minute recess had given the council time to read the direction but acknowledgement. The formal withdrawal of something formal required its own formal moment. The documentation you submitted, Graves said. Marion Webb's analysis, the financial timeline, and the personal testimony, all of it withdrawn. I'm requesting the council treat those materials as non-entered. Warren paused. The approach I took to collecting the personal testimony was inappropriate. I want that noted as well. Graves made a small notation. The council member to his right, a woman named Park, whom Audrey had flagged as a genuine unknown quantity, watched Warren with the careful attention of someone filing information they hadn't expected to receive. Noted, Graves said. He looked at the table. The council will still address the question of the engagement's nature since it was raised before us and the parties are present. He looked at Ronan. You've indicated a willingness to formalize. Yes, Ronan said. And the other party? Graves looked at Audrey. Still that direct, unhurried attention. Ms. Whitcomb, you've already answered this question once today, but I want to give you the opportunity again, with Warren's withdrawal on record, and with no strategic pressure remaining. Is this what you want? The room was very quiet. Audrey thought about the question the way you think about a question you've already answered, but that deserves the full weight of being considered again anyway. She thought about a hotel bar, and a midnight blue gown, and an entryway, and a hand against her back, and a man who told her to make them believe every second of it, and had then, somewhere along the way, started believing it himself. She thought about architectural drawings face down on a drafting table. About 3 graves visited every month, not because it fixed anything, but because those people were owed that much. About a scholarship fund with no name attached to it, and 11 kids this year, and 7 of them the first in their families to finish high school. She thought about Penny, who had looked at her across a lunch table and said, "That's not something you do as a transaction." "Yes," she said. "It is." Graves looked at the council. The accounting happened brief, efficient, the product of people who had been making collective decisions for decades and had developed the shorthand for it. The council will recognize the formalization, Graves said. We'll require a witness from each side and a licensed officiant. If the parties are prepared to proceed today, the council can provide both. Warren said, "I'll witness for the Lockwood side." He said it without being asked. He said it the way a man says something when he has decided that the only remaining move that carries any dignity is to do it completely. Ronan looked at him. Warren held his gaze. The challenge is withdrawn. The alliance question remains open not as a demand, not with conditions. As a conversation we can have when both families are ready. He paused. This is my way of saying, I'm ready to have it differently. Something passed between the 2 men across the table. Not forgiveness, that was too clean a word for what it was. More like the mutual recognition of 2 people who have been fighting over the same ground for years and have just agreed, without saying it directly, that the ground can be redrawn. Constance will witness for us, Ronan said. Constance, who was seated to his left and had been very still through the exchange, looked at her son. Her face did something Audrey had not seen it do in all the weeks she'd been in the Blackridge house. It went briefly, completely unguarded. Just a second. Then it returned to its composed surface, but different, like the composition meant something different now than it had before. Yes, Constance said. Of course. The officiant was a judge named Harlow, who was apparently available at short notice in the way that certain individuals in certain circles are available at short notice, with competence, discretion, a sound like green wood splitting, and the particular grace of someone who has presided over significant moments and understands that their job is to hold the container for the moment rather than direct its contents. He arrived in 12 minutes. While they waited, Geneva stood. She crossed the room to Ronan. She stopped in front of him with the posture of someone who has rehearsed nothing and is therefore working entirely from what remains when preparation runs out. She looked at him for a moment with the specific weight of a person who has been carrying something for 3 years and has just set it down in public. I didn't know it would go the way it went, she said. I have told myself other versions of that for 3 years, and this is the only true one. I used the connection because my father told me the alliance was the goal, and I thought, she stopped. It doesn't matter what I thought. The result was what it was. Ronan looked at her. His face was very still. Marcus had a daughter, he said. She's 6 now. She has never met her father. He said it without anger. With the flatness of a person reporting a fact that has been a fact for 3 years and will continue to be a fact indefinitely. Daniel's mother is still alive. She asks about the investigation every time I see her. Geneva held his gaze. She didn't look away, I know, she said. I'm not able to give you absolution. I'm not the right person for that, and it's not something I have the standing to offer. He paused. But I believe you didn't intend it. That's what it costs me to say. I believe it, and I'm saying it, and that's the limit of what I have. Geneva nodded once. It was the nod of someone receiving exactly what was offered and not asking for more. She went back to her seat. Ronan looked at the table for a moment. Then he looked at Audrey with the expression of a man who has just done something that cost him and is locating himself in the present again. She looked back at him. She didn't say anything. Sometimes the right response to a cost paid is just to witness it. Judge Harlow was in his early 60s and had the demeanor of someone who had stopped being surprised by the circumstances of events he was asked to officiate. He sat up at the end of the mahogany table with the efficiency of a man who had done this in stranger rooms than this one, which Audrey chose to find reassuring. The counsel remained seated. Warren remained. Geneva remained. Constance stood at Ronan's left. Vaughn, who had been in the corridor and was summoned by a text, stood near the door. And Penny arrived. Audrey hadn't expected that. She turned when the door opened, and Penny came in still in her clothes, backpack strap over one shoulder, having been collected by Vaughn's associate from the new ones without more than an hour's notice. And Penny stopped in the doorway and looked at the room and then at her sister and did the rapid inventory that Penny always did, the one that processed a situation completely before she allowed herself to react to it. Then she walked across the room and stood beside Audrey. "You could have warned me," she said quietly. "I didn't know it was happening today until an hour ago. You look like you've been awake for 3 days. 2.5. Penny looked at Ronan. He looked back at her, with the composed directness he used with everyone, which Audrey had observed was the thing Penny responded to in him. The absence of the condescension most adults aimed at teenagers without noticing it. "You're going to take care of her," Penny said to him. It wasn't a question. "Yes," he said. "And if you don't—" "Penny," Audrey said. "I'm just establishing the terms," Penny said. She shifted her backpack. "Okay, fine. Let's do this." Something moved through Ronan's face that was unmistakably a held laugh. He pressed his lips together and looked at the table, and when he looked back up, his expression was composed again, but the edges of it were different. Harlow looked at the room and said, "Shall we proceed?" The ceremony was short. Not curtly short, meaningfully short. The way things are short when the words are load-bearing rather than decorative. Harlow had clearly done enough of these to understand which parts were containers and which were content, and he moved through the containers efficiently and let the content breathe. He asked Ronan if he took Audrey Whitcomb as his wife. Ronan looked at her and said yes with the quiet certainty of a man who had decided something and was not going to qualify it. He asked Audrey if she took Ronan Blackridge as her husband. She looked at him at the exhaustion, and the cut on his lip mostly healed, and the thing in his eyes that she'd been watching work its way to the surface for 3 weeks, and said yes with the same. Certainty, different in texture, but equal in weight. Harlow said the words that made it legal. Constance touched her son's arm once briefly. Penny made a sound beside Audrey that was immediately controlled, but had been, for one fraction of a second, the sound a person makes when something they've been hoping for arrives without warning. Warren, across the table, inclined his head, a gesture that contained more than it displayed, the way most significant things Warren Lockwood did contained more than they displayed, except that this time what it contained was not strategy. It was as close as she could read it, something genuine. Geneva looked at her hands. Ronan and Audrey looked at each other, across the moment that had just become real, and the room held its breath for a second, and then everything exhaled at once. The council's formal findings came 3 days later, delivered in a document that Vaughn summarized for them over breakfast, because the document itself was 40 pages of the specific language that governing bodies use when they want to say something without saying it directly. The fraudulent engagement was noted as having originated under circumstances the council found irregular but not unprecedented, given the pressure being applied by the challenging party. The Lockwood challenge was formally recorded as withdrawn. The financial documentation pertaining to Constance's fund was referred for review by a 2-member council subcommittee, with the understanding that the legacy debt framing would be the interpretive starting point rather than the collaboration framing Warren had presented. Warren's use of minor testimony was recorded as a procedural violation with a formal note that would remain in the Lockwood family's counsel file. The marriage was recognized. The Lockwood-Blackridge alliance question was left open, not resolved, not abandoned. Tabled in the specific way powerful people table things, when they've decided the current approach isn't working and they need to find a different one. Audrey read the summary and drank her coffee and thought about how much of her life over the past month had been determined by documents she hadn't read, and rooms she hadn't known existed, and decisions made by people she'd never heard of until she accepted $20,000 in a hotel bar. The subcommittee review, she said to Vaughn, for Constance's fund. How long does that take? 4 to 6 weeks. The outcome is probably favorable given the withdrawal, but it's not guaranteed. What does Constance need to prepare? Vaughn looked at her with the expression he occasionally produced when something she said recalibrated his sense of who she was in the room. The full documentation she already provided, plus her communications with the legacy contacts over the full 7-year period. Does she have those organized? Not fully. Tell her I'll help her organize them. She set down her coffee. I managed event documentation for 4 years. It's the same skill set. Vaughn made a note. Ronan came in from the corridor, jacket off, the specific rumple of a man who had been on call since 7 in the morning, handling the organizational elements that the council session had stirred up. He poured coffee, looked at the table, looked at Audrey. The subcommittee, she said. I'm going to help Constance prepare her documentation. He looked at her for a moment. You don't have to do that. I know. She looked back at her coffee. I want the review to go well. Constance made a bad call for a reason I understand. That doesn't need to follow her indefinitely if we can build the record properly. He sat down across from her. He had his coffee in both hands the way he always did in the morning, the other habit she'd cataloged in the first week that made him look less like a mafia boss and more like a person. He looked at her with the expression she'd been watching evolve from assessment to something warmer and more complicated over the course of a month. We need to talk about the 60,000, he said. She looked at him. The original agreement was 3 months. We're not 3 months in. He set the coffee down. I want to void that agreement. Ronan, I want to void it, he said again, because you are not a contractor, and I don't want there to be a document in existence that frames you as one. Whatever financial structure makes sense for your situation going forward, we build it differently. He held her gaze. What you walked into that council room and did was not a contracted service. She thought about it. The practical part of her, the part that had been calculating finances since she was 24 years old, wanted to argue. The other part of her understood what he was saying. Penny's education, she said, is already guaranteed. That doesn't change regardless of anything else. Separate from the scholarship fund. Yes, completely separate, directly guaranteed. He paused. I should have structured it that way from the beginning instead of folding it into the general commitment. You were improvising, we both were. She looked at the table. Void the agreement. But I'm keeping the 20,000 from the first dinner. He almost smiled. Constance still owes you that. Constance still owes me that, she confirmed. Constance, when informed that Audrey wanted to help organize her documentation for the subcommittee review, said nothing for a moment, and then said, You don't need to do this. I know, Audrey said. I'm doing it anyway. They worked on it across 4 days at the dining room table. It was in its way, not unlike the 3 days before the council session documents spread across surfaces, a chronology being built, the labor of making a complicated truth legible to people who had no context for it. Except this time the pressure was lower, and the conversation between them was different. On the 3rd day, Constance said, I told you in the guest house not to break his concentration. Audrey looked up from the filing she was organizing. He's drawing again, Constance said. Not just rough sketches. Actual plans. He was on the drafting table until 2 in the morning last Tuesday. She looked at the documents in front of her. He hasn't done that since he was 29. He told me about the architecture, Audrey said. That he studied it before your husband died. Did he tell you about the building he designed in his 3rd year? The one his professor tried to get him to submit for a national competition. No. Constance smiled. It was a small smile, the kind that comes from a specific memory rather than general warmth. He refused. He said it wasn't finished. It never was finished, because his father's health changed that semester, and he came home and the building stayed in a drawer somewhere. She paused. I don't know where that drawer is anymore. Audrey looked at her hands. She thought about unfinished things and the specific patience required to return to them after years of distance, and whether that patience was easier or harder when someone was there who already knew the story. The community center, she said. The one connected to the scholarship foundation. Constance looked at her. He mentioned it once. Building something connected to the scholarship work. Audrey went back to her filing. I think that's what he's working on. Constance was quiet for a long moment. My husband would not have let him leave, she said finally. He would have found a way to keep Ronan in the business regardless. It was always going to end the same way, Ronan coming home, the architecture going into the drawer, the family taking what it needed. She said it without bitterness, with the specific weight of a woman who has examined a fact from every angle over a long period of time and arrived at understanding without peace. I have spent years trying to determine whether that was inevitable or whether I could have changed it if I'd been different. I don't have an answer. You don't need one, Audrey said. Constance looked at her. You can't rebuild what the drawer has, Audrey said. But the drafting table is there now. That's the thing you have access to. She looked up from the documents. That's enough. They went back to work. Penny came to the estate the following Saturday with an overnight bag and the specific energy of someone who had decided they were going to feel at home somewhere and were going to do it by sheer force of normality. She ate at the kitchen table and raided the coffee maker, and went into the garden and identified 3 plants she said were being overwatered and delivered this assessment to Constance without apparent concern for the social dynamics involved. Constance listened to the overwatering diagnosis with an expression that moved through several stages before settling on something that looked like interest. Which one, she said. Penny showed her. Audrey watched from the kitchen window and thought about the word family and the various shapes it takes, and how rarely the shape matches the one you thought you were going to get. That evening after dinner, Ronan and Penny ended up at the kitchen table with a college application essay that Penny had been avoiding. Audrey heard them through the doorway, Penny's voice, going through the specific defensiveness of someone who knows a draft is bad and doesn't want to hear it confirmed, and Ronan's voice, low and even not confirming it, but asking her what she actually wanted to say underneath the draft she'd written. I don't know, Penny said. You do. Say the version you'd tell a person, not the version you think the application wants. A pause. The version I'd tell a person is about Audrey. Then write that. It sounds I don't know, like I'm leaning on her story instead of having my own. Those aren't separate, Ronan said. Her story built the ground you're standing on. That's not borrowing. That's the honest account of who you are and how you got here. A pause. The application wants to know who you are. Tell them. Audrey stepped away from the doorway. She went to the sitting room and sat down and looked at the city lights through the window and breathed through something that didn't have a clean name. After a while, she heard Ronan's footsteps in the corridor. He came into the sitting room and sat in the chair across from her. She's working on the draft, he said. I heard. He looked at her. Are you okay? Yes, she meant it. I'm just recalibrating. She looked at the window. A month ago, I was in a hotel bar trying to figure out how to tell my sister that I'd been fired. And now we're here, and she's in your kitchen writing a college essay. And she paused. It's a lot to hold in the same frame. He was quiet for a moment. I know, he said. I've been doing the same thing. She looked at him. What's your version of it? He considered the question with the seriousness he gave most things. 6 weeks ago, the biggest problem I had was Warren's marriage campaign, which I thought I understood completely. Now I have, he gestured, a small motion that indicated the house and everything in it. A different situation. Better or worse? Incomparably better. He said it without hesitation or decoration. Just the fact of it. She looked at him across the sitting room. The building, she said. The community center. Constance told me that's what you're working on. He didn't answer immediately. The scholarship kids need somewhere to study that isn't a library with limited hours or a kitchen table in an apartment with 3 other people in it, he said finally. The foundation has the capital. The question was always what to build and where, and whether the city would partner on the zoning. He paused. A contact at the planning office thinks the site on Dorchester Ave is workable. Dorchester Ave, she said. That's the right neighborhood. Yes. She looked at him. Can I see the plans? He looked at her for a moment with the same expression he'd had when she'd asked about the drawings the first time, the expression of someone encountering a question they hadn't anticipated and reassessing who they were talking to. Come on, he said. They went to the study. The drafting table was covered in plans, not rough sketches, real ones, detailed and measured and built with the specific confidence of someone who had been doing the geometry of space in their head for years and was finally putting it on paper. She stood beside him and he walked her through it, the entrance, designed to feel open rather than institutional, the study rooms with windows that caught afternoon light, the event space that could hold 200 or collapse into thirds for smaller gatherings, the outdoor courtyard that connected to the street in a way that said this building belongs to the neighborhood rather than the neighborhood belongs to this building. She looked at it for a long time. The entrance hall, she said. The ceiling height, 22 feet. It makes it feel like arriving somewhere that expects you. She traced the line without touching the paper. Most public buildings make you feel small in the entrance. This goes the other way. He was looking at her, looking at the plans. That was the intention. How long have you been designing it? The concept has been in my head for 3 years. The actual plans, he paused. About 3 weeks. 3 weeks. She didn't say it out loud, but she heard the timeline. It's good work, she said. It's not finished. I know. It's still good work. He looked at the plans. She watched his face in the study light, the specific quality of a man who has found his way back to something he'd given up and is still slightly disbelieving about the fact that it's still there waiting. The professor, she said. The one who wanted you to submit the competition piece. He looked at her. Constance mentioned him. Professor Aldrich. He retired about 6 years ago. He paused. He sends me an email every year on the anniversary of the last day of his class. Just checking in. Do you answer? I started answering them about 3 weeks ago. She looked at the plans again. The 22-foot entrance ceiling. The courtyard that belonged to the neighborhood. He'd like these, she said. He would. Ronan was quiet for a moment. He's agreed to consult on the structural review. Informally, she turned to look at him. He was looking at the plans with the expression of a man who has made several decisions in the last 3 weeks that he hadn't been able to make in the years before, and is still understanding his own reasons for them. She didn't analyze it out loud. She just stood beside him and looked at the building he was building for kids who needed somewhere to be. The subcommittee review of Constance's fund concluded in 5 weeks rather than 6. The finding was what Vaughn had cautiously predicted: the legacy debt framing was accepted. The transfers were characterized as management of inherited obligation rather than active collaboration, and the matter was closed without further action. Constance received the finding in the dining room, read it twice, set it on the table, and looked at Audrey. Thank you, she said. 2 words with more in them than 2 words usually carry. The documentation was solid, Audrey said. We just organized it so it could be seen. Warren called Ronan the following week. Not a formal contact. An actual call, the kind where the formality has been stripped out because the formality served a purpose transition applies. They spoke for 20 minutes. Audrey was in the kitchen and heard none of it and asked about none of it afterward, because some conversations belong to the people who have them. What she gathered from the way Ronan moved through the rest of the evening was that it had been real, not resolved, not healed, but real, which was the only starting point for anything that might eventually become something better. Geneva called once, 2 weeks after the council session. She called Ronan's number, got Audrey an accident of timing. Ronan was with Vaughn, and there was a moment of silence on the line, before Geneva said, I'll call back. You don't have to, Audrey said. Another pause. I wanted to say something to him, Geneva said. It can wait. I can tell him you called, please. A beat. I'm sorry for my part in what happened to your family. in how everything was handled. She said it with the specific, careful weight of a person who has been turning a sentence over for weeks before saying it. I don't expect that to mean anything. I just wanted to say it to someone in the household directly. Audrey held the phone for a moment. I'll tell him you called, she said. He'll call you back when he's ready. Thank you. The call ended. She stood in the kitchen with the phone in her hand and thought about 3 years and 3 graves and the complexity of things that can't be undone and what it means to try to account for them anyway. Then she put the phone down and went to find Ronan. Spring arrived with the specific Boston stubbornness of a season that knows it's going to win eventually, but takes its time about it. The Foundation's event programming was Audrey's by March, not informally, not as an extension of the engagement performance, but as an actual role with an actual structure that she'd designed herself and presented to the Foundation's board and had approved on its own merits. She was good at it. She'd been good at it before. In the stripped-down version, she'd been practicing for 4 years without the resources to do it properly. With the Foundation's budget and Constance's network and the specific credibility that came from being genuinely invested in the outcomes rather than contracted for the delivery, she was very good at it. The first major event she ran was the Scholarship Fund's annual, gathering the 11 students, their families, the Foundation's contributing partners. She'd redesigned the format from the previous year's version, which Vaughn described as nice dirs with speeches, into something that actually centered the students rather than the donors. The students presented. The donors listened. 3 of the families had never been in a room like that before, and she built the room so that this was invisible, so that every person in it felt like they were exactly where they were supposed to be. Ronan watched from the back of the room for the last 20 minutes and said nothing to her about it until they were in the car going home. And then he said, "The way you redesigned the format. Did you test it with any of the students first?" 2 of them. I asked what they'd want to be able to say to a room of adults who had invested in them. Both of them said they wanted to be asked questions about their actual plans, not make a speech. She looked out the window. So I built the format around that. The room felt different because of it. Rooms feel different when the people who are supposed to be at the center of them actually are. He looked at her with that expression. The one she'd stopped trying to catalog and had started just receiving. The community center, he said. The event space. I know, she said. I'm already thinking about it. Penny's college application was submitted in December, and the essay was about Audrey. Not sentimental, not in the way essays are sentimental when the writer is performing emotion rather than reporting it. It was specific and honest about what it looked like to watch someone carry more than they could comfortably hold and keep moving anyway, and about what that demonstrated about the difference between capacity and choice. About how the thing that had shaped her most wasn't a lesson or a principle, but a person consistently doing a hard thing without making it into a performance of sacrifice. Penny showed Audrey the final draft without asking permission or soliciting feedback. She sent it by text one evening with a message that said, "Fi, this is what I said." Audrey read it, sitting on the edge of the guesthouse bed, which was still her space, still where she went when she needed to think, even though the guesthouse had functionally merged into the larger rhythm of the estate. She read it once and then sat with it for a while. She didn't text back immediately. When she did, she sent, "It's honest." Penny responded, "It's true." Then I got the words from a conversation I had with Ronan, actually. Then, "Don't tell him I said that it'll go to his head." Audrey laughed in the empty guest house at 9:15, on a Tuesday evening, which was not something she'd done alone in some time. The acceptance came in March. Penny called Audrey from school, the same school where Warren Lockwood had stood outside in November and used her against her own family, and the call was incoherent for the first 45 seconds in the specific way that good news is. Incoherent when it's larger than the containers you built for it. "Bu," Penny managed. "Audrey, Bu." Full they said the financial Audrey. "I heard you," Audrey said. Her voice came out very steady, which was the thing that happened when something too large arrived. Her voice went steady while everything else moved. "I heard every word. Tell me you're not crying." "I'm not crying. You sound like you're crying." "I'm driving," she said. She wasn't driving. She was sitting at her desk in the foundation office. "I'll call you back in 10 minutes. She didn't call back in 10 minutes. She sat at her desk and let her eyes be wet for a specific amount of time, and then she called Ronan. He answered on the second ring. "Boo," she said. A pause. "Then full package?" "Full package." She heard him breathe. Just once. Slow. The breathing of a man receiving information meant something to him in a place he doesn't usually let things reach. "Tell her congratulations from me," he said. "Tell her yourself. She'll want to hear it from you." A pause. "Okay," he said. Summer, the Dorchester Ave site broke ground in June. Audrey stood beside Ronan at the edge of the site in construction boots. She'd bought herself practical, not decorative, and watched the excavation begin. Constance was there. Penny was there. Vaughn stood at the perimeter with the specific posture of a man who had spent his career preventing things from going wrong and was cautiously allowing himself to stand near something that was going right. Professor Aldrich came. He was 76 and moved slowly, and when he saw the plans posted at the site entrance, he stood in front of them for a long time without speaking. Then he turned to Ronan and said, "The entrance ceiling." 22 feet, Ronan said. "I know, I can read plans." Aldrich looked at him. "You were always going to build something real. I just didn't know when." Ronan stood beside his old professor and looked at the site, the excavation beginning, the shape of what it was going to be already present in the ground if you knew how to read it, and said nothing, because there wasn't anything to add. Audrey stood slightly behind them and watched and thought about unfinished things. Months later, enough months that Boston had gone through another full turn of seasons, and the community center was a building you could walk through, rather than a drawing on a table. Audrey and Ronan stood on the terrace at the back of the Blackridge estate. It was evening. The city was doing what the city does in that particular hour, between day and dark when the lights are coming on and the skyline holds two kinds of light at once. She had a glass of something. He had coffee, which was very on-brand for 10 in the evening. She'd been thinking about the hotel bar. She thought about it sometimes not with regret or nostalgia, but with the specific interest of someone trying to understand how a chain of events becomes a life. The woman sat there with 2 glasses of something expensive, and a termination letter, and 63 days of delinquent rent. The stranger who had sat beside her, the offer that should have sent her straight for the door. "I have a question," she said. He looked at her. That first evening. The dinner. If it had worked, if one evening had been enough for Warren to back down, what would you have done with me? He considered the question with the seriousness he gave everything. Paid you. Had Vaughn drive you home, and that would have been it. Yes. You wouldn't have thought about it again. A pause. "I don't know." He looked at the city. "I told myself at the time that it was a contained situation. My mother's scheme, one evening, a stranger who needed money. I told myself it had a clean edge. Did you believe it?" "I believed it until you said if I'd known earlier, I would have asked for more." He was quiet. That was the first true thing I'd heard in a long time that I didn't expect to hear. She thought about that. "You want to know something?" she said. "Yes." When I said it, I was buying time. I didn't have a second thought prepared, and I needed to say something that would hold the moment while I found my footing. She looked at the city. It came out, and it happened to be true. He turned to look at her. Something in his face moved the way it moved when he found something genuinely unexpected. "So you were improvising, constantly, from the minute I got out of that car until..." She paused. "I don't know exactly when I stopped." "I don't either," he said. "Somewhere in the middle, before I noticed. The city held its 2 kinds of light. The coffee in his hand was going cool, which she knew, because she'd watched him let his coffee go cool enough times to know it meant he was sufficiently in a conversation to stop tracking the coffee. "Constance still owes me $20,000, she said. He exhaled, not quite a laugh, but adjacent to one. "She says she paid you with a husband. That's not how transactions work. It's how she thinks they work. She's wrong. She knows she's wrong. She just enjoys being wrong about it." He set the coffee down on the terrace railing. He turned toward her. "You could let it go." "I could," she said. "I'm not going to." He looked at her with the expression she'd stopped cataloging because it didn't need cataloging anymore. She knew what it meant. She'd known for a while. He reached out and touched her face, brief and specific. The gesture of a man who has made peace with the fact that he is someone who does this now reaches for a person, rather than maintaining the controlled distance that used to feel like safety. "Thank you," he said. She looked at him. "For what, specifically?" "For not leaving when you could have. I could have left multiple times." "I know, the first night. After the dinner, when you offered the 3 months. I almost said no. I know that too. What would you have done?" He thought about it, found another way, a worse one. He paused. The worst version of the next 6 months, without what actually happened. She thought about the worst version. The council session without the true story. Warren's version standing unopposed. The building still in his head and not on the drafting table. The scholarship fund, invisible and small and administered in isolation. 3 graves every month, and no one who knew why. "The 20,000, she said. "Audrey, I'm serious. She owes me." From inside the house, with the specific timing of a woman who had very good hearing and absolutely had been listening. For this moment, Constance's voice arrived through the open terrace door. "I paid you with a husband. The debt is settled." Audrey laughed. It came out full and real, and she didn't try to manage it, didn't quiet it down or redirect it into something more composed. She just laughed at 10 in the evening on the back terrace of a house she'd never heard of 11 months ago, while the sitch lit itself up against the dark. Ronan shook his head. The held-law-see expression, the one she'd seen him lose his grip on that first Saturday. When Penny established the terms, it surfaced completely this time. Genuine and unguarded. A sound like, the face of a man who has forgotten to maintain the distance and has found in the forgetting that the thing he thought the distance was protecting him from is exactly the thing he needed most. He pulled her in. Not dramatically. Not with the performance of a feeling, just the ordinary, specific gravity of a person pulling someone close because they're there and they're his, and the evening is the right temperature, and the city is doing the thing it does, and none of this requires annotation. She leaned into it. She was not performing either. Inside, somewhere in the house, Penny was doing homework at the kitchen table she had claimed as her own specific homework location over the months of visits that had become something more like habitation. Constance was in her sitting room with a book she'd been on the same chapter of for 2 weeks, because she kept stopping to think. The drafting table in the study held the next phase of the community center plans. A sound like green wood splitting, the interior details that Ronan had been working on with Professor Aldrich over Tuesday afternoon calls that had quietly become the part of the week he rearranged other things to protect. And on the terrace, the woman who had walked into a hotel bar with nothing she could count on, and walked out of it with a stranger's number in her phone, and 20,000 reasons to show up at a mansion she'd never seen. A sound like green wood splitting stood in the evening and looked at the city and felt the weight of the year behind her and the different weight of everything in front. She thought about what she would have said to herself in that bar if she could have said anything. She wouldn't have said, "Don't worry, it works out." That was too clean. She'd have said, "It gets complicated in ways you can't predict, and the ways you can't predict are the ones that matter, and the woman you are going to need to be is already in you. You have just never been in a situation that required all of her at once." That was all. That would have been enough. Ronan's hand was warm at her back. The city ran its lights against the dark. Penny somewhere inside the house was writing something true about someone she loved. And the mafia boss who had spent 37 years believing that proximity was a vulnerability, and the desperate woman she had to carry 5 years believing that she had to carry everything alone, had both been wrong about the same thing, in different ways for different reasons. They'd figured that out together. Neither of them was walking away.